When Scandinavian rulers gathered at Kalmar in the late 14th century, they forged a bold experiment, a united crown over Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The architect was Queen Margaret of Denmark, whose adopted heir, Eric of Pomerania, was crowned in Kalmar in the year we now remember as 1397. The union promised shared defense, coordinated trade policy, and a common front against the Hanseatic League and German princely ambitions along the Baltic. On paper, it pooled timber, iron, furs, and fisheries into one northern power. In practice, it planted a question that would haunt the next century. Who would truly lead, Copenhagen or Stockholm? The early decades revealed the imbalance. Denmark possessed the richer farmlands, the vital Öresund tolls, and the administrative apparatus to steer the Union. Swedish nobles, bishops, and mining interests bristled as they watched profits and offices flow south. The iron from Bergslagen and copper from Falun were lifeblood for Swedish elites, and Hanseatic merchants in Lübeck and Danzig worked these networks with skill. When royal governors pressed too hard for taxes or tried to police trade routes, local grievances flared into wider resistance. The Union's central promise of strength became, for many Swedes, a mechanism of Danish dominance. The first major shock came with the rebellion of Engelbrekt Engelbrektsson in the early 15th century. A miner and nobleman, Engelbrekt led a coalition of townsmen, miners, and lesser nobles against abusive bailiffs and burdensome exactions. His uprising forced concessions and briefly elevated him as a national figure, showing that Swedish society could mobilize beyond courtly intrigue. Although Engelbrekt's murder ended his personal story, the movement he led reshaped politics by legitimizing the idea that Sweden could act apart from Copenhagen when its interests were threatened. Cause met effect. Union misrule produced organized resistance, and that resistance produced new institutions. Out of this turbulence emerged the Sture regencies, first under Sten Sture the Elder, and later under Sten Sture the Younger. The Stures did not declare a clean break. Instead, they practiced selective autonomy while acknowledging a union in principle. This approach protected Swedish mining revenues, strengthened the Riksdag of the estates as a forum for consent, and cultivated a national officer corps. The Sture party relied on alliances with burghers and miners, and it balanced rural noble anxieties with urban commercial needs. Each step made the administrative machinery in Stockholm more capable, even as it deepened the rift with Danish royal ambition. Across the straits, Denmark's rulers, King Hans, known also as John of Denmark and later Christian II, sought to tighten the reins. They viewed Swedish semi-independence as a legal fiction, undermining the Union's purpose. Danish interventions came with two motives: to reassert monarchical authority and to harness Swedish resources in wider Baltic competition. Diplomacy alternated with force. When bargaining failed, armies marched, and coastal towns felt the pressure of blockades and raids. The more Copenhagen pushed, the more Swedish leaders framed their cause as a defense of law and custom against foreign encroachment. Religion and law were not mere ornaments in this contest, they were weapons. The late medieval church in Sweden was wealthy, landed, and politically influential. Bishops could sway estates, finance armies, and broker deals. Danish kings tried to cultivate church allies to counter the Sture faction, while Swedish regents worked to keep ecclesiastical wealth oriented towards Stockholm. Meanwhile, the Hanseatic League played a careful game, sometimes helping Denmark to secure tolls, sometimes dealing with Swedish regents to preserve trade privileges in ports like Stockholm and Kalmar. These cross-currents made the Baltic a chessboard of clergy, merchants, and crowns. By the early 16th century, tensions reached a terrible climax. Christian II, energetic and ruthless, launched a campaign to crush Swedish autonomy once and for all. He captured Stockholm after a hard struggle and convened a solemn ceremony to confirm his authority. What followed in late autumn of 1520 is remembered as the Stockholm bloodbath, a judicial purge that executed leading nobles, bishops, and civic figures under charges of heresy and treason. Contemporary witnesses recalled the chill of public squares, the roll of drums, and the shock of seeing pillars of local society cut down. A political message was unmistakable. Resistance would be answered with fear. The executions, meant to cow the country, had the opposite effect. Families of the dead rallied kinsmen, towns closed ranks. Miners in Dalarna took stock of their strength. In this charged atmosphere, a young noble named Gustaf Eriksson, later known as Gustav Vasa, escaped Danish captivity and made his way north through the forests and snow of central Sweden. He sought support among the dalesmen who were proud of their traditions and resentful of outside interference. At first, the villagers hesitated to risk everything. Then, the news of the bloodbath and new levies arrived, and the mood hardened. The story that they skied after him near Sälen to call him back, while later romanticized, captures a truth. The countryside was ready to move. Gustav's appeal combined moral outrage with practical promises. He spoke of restoring lawful governance, protecting miners' rights, and pushing back against foreign garrisons. Crucially, he courted Lübeck, whose merchants had grievances of their own against Danish policies. Loans, ships, and technical expertise from the Hanseatic city gave the uprising a maritime edge, allowing Swedish forces to challenge Danish control along the coasts and on the lakes. Cause and effect once more aligned. The shock of the bloodbath opened a political space. Gustav filled it with organization, messaging, and foreign support. The uprising became a revolution. The conflict unfolded as a series of regional campaigns that stitched together a national movement. In the north and center, levies of peasants and miners harried Danish strongpoints, cut supply lines, and forced capitulations. In the south and along the coast, Hanseatic-backed flotillas disrupted Danish shipping and emboldened towns sympathetic to the rebellion. The Riksdag met its Strängnäs and recognized Gustav as regent, a constitutional step that framed the struggle not as feudal rebellion, but as a lawful restoration of Sweden's rights. Each victory drew more adherents. Each oath altered the balance of legitimacy. Where Danish governors had once spoken with authority, they now negotiated for safe conduct. The geography of Sweden mattered. Long distances, dense forests, and winter roads favored defenders who knew the terrain. The Falun mines provided resources, while lake networks offered interior lines of movement. Danish forces, skilled and disciplined, found themselves stretched between coastal obligations and stubborn inland resistance. At critical moments, Gustav's commanders used speed and local knowledge to surprise garrisons and compel withdrawals. Warfare in this period was not only set-piece battles, it was siegecraft, convoy interception, and the patient cultivation of allegiance among towns and parishes. Political symbolism accompanied military progress. The rebel seal and proclamations emphasized continuity with ancient law and the common good. Guilds and parish assemblies were courted, and clergy who opposed Danish policy found room to maneuver. The rhetoric framed Christian II not simply as a rival king, but as a violator of sacred and civic norms. This mattered in a late medieval world where legitimacy flowed through oaths and rites as much as through swords. When Stockholm finally opened its gates, it was not merely a strategic fortress changing hands. It was a moral center returning to what many believed was the rightful order. By mid-1523, the uprising had achieved its political goal. The estates chose Gustav as king, and he entered Stockholm to acclamations and the ringing of church bells. The coronation itself would come later, but the essential transfer of sovereignty had occurred. Sweden had stepped out of the Kalmar Union not with a negotiated amendment, but with a decisive act of will, supported by arms, law, and commerce. The new monarch inherited a battered realm with empty coffers, suspicious nobles, and wary foreign creditors. Yet he also inherited something priceless, a mandate born of popular mobilization and a clear enemy overcome. The defeat of Christian II in Sweden did not erase Denmark-Norway as a regional power, nor did it dissolve the web of Baltic rivalries. It did, however, shatter the premise that a centralized Danish monarchy could rule Sweden as a subordinate partner. The cause and effect chain is stark. Danish attempts to discipline the Union produced Swedish regencies. Regencies nurtured institutions and identities. Royal terror produced national revolt. Revolt produced a sovereign crown in Stockholm. The Kalmar Union, conceived as a shield against outside threats, succumbed to the fissures within its own design. Human costs marked the path. Families mourned those lost in the bloodbath and in sieges from Kalmar to Stockholm. Merchants saw trade disrupted, and peasants bore the weight of levies and requisitions. Yet there were glimpses of renewal. Towns regained a measure of self-direction. Miners negotiated charters. The Riksdag emerged with a stronger voice in extraordinary moments. In sermons and council chambers, people debated the meaning of law, authority, and community. A chronicler might have summed it up with a line often attributed to the era's moralists: "Tyranny breeds resistance, and resistance breeds new law." Gustav Vasa's personal journey became emblematic of the new order. His escape from captivity, his appeals in the high valleys, and his march into Stockholm offered a narrative of courage and calculation that later generations would celebrate. Behind the legend stood a keen political mind. He understood debt and revenue, the value of Lübeck's favor, and the need to bind the estates without becoming their captive. He also understood that stability required more than banners and oaths. It demanded a restructured state that could feed armies, pay officials, and command loyalty beyond emergency. Gustav Vasa entered Stockholm as a king with an empty treasury and a fragile coalition. Independence had been won, but survival required structure, revenue, and legitimacy that did not rely on emergency oaths. The crown had to feed garrisons, tame fractious nobles, and service foreign debts owed above all to Lübeck. In this new reality, faith, law, and finance were not separate fields. They became the tools of state building, and the choices Gustav made in the first years of his reign would rewire Sweden's politics for generations. The Reformation offered both a language and a ledger. Across Northern Europe, rulers were testing whether Lutheran teaching could justify and fund centralized monarchy. In Sweden, reform began as cautious experimentation. Preachers like Olaus Petri argued that scripture should guide worship and that sermons in the vernacular would strengthen moral life. To a cash-strapped king, the deeper attraction was structural. Church wealth could shift from Rome-aligned institutions to the needs of the realm. The theological and the fiscal marched together, each giving the other momentum. The pivot point came at the Riksdag in Västerås in the year we remember as 1527. There, Gustav secured decisions that sanctioned the seizure of certain church properties and the redirection of revenues to the crown. Monastic houses faced closure. Episcopal lands were inventoried. Chalices and bells could be called in for minting. The immediate effect was cash and collateral, but the lasting change was administrative. By listing, valuing, and reassigning church assets, the royal chancery learned to see the kingdom as an account book, parishes, towns, and mines as entries to be balanced. Reform moved from law to life through synods and appointments. At Örebro in the late 1520s, churchmen discussed doctrine and discipline under royal eyes. Soon after, Laurentius Petri was elevated as Archbishop at Uppsala, a signal that Sweden would manage its own ecclesiastical hierarchy. Liturgies shifted toward the vernacular, clerical marriage gained acceptance, and preaching took center stage. None of this unfolded without friction. Some bishops resisted. Rural congregations worried about change. Magnates wondered whether the crown's reach would stop with church lands or roll onto noble estates. Gustav's answer was to pair spiritual revision with administrative consolidation. He strengthened the royal council, expanded the chancery, and tightened oversight of local bailiffs who collected taxes and enforced decrees. Provincial visitations audited accounts and punished embezzlement. The king's letters, more numerous and more exacting with each passing year, standardized how orders were written and obeyed. A pattern emerged: gather information, issue rules, measure compliance, and use that data to plan the next move. The habit of counting and recording became the quiet engine of state. trade and towns became testbeds for this new style of governance. Stockholm's customs house tracked imports and exports with greater discipline, and tolls were adjusted to capture increased revenue from iron and copper. Harbor fees, warehouse rules, and guild privileges were all calibrated toward a single goal: predictable cash flow. The king courted foreign merchants when it suited the treasury and squeezed them when it did not. Lübeck's early leverage, born of wartime loans, was gradually reduced as Sweden built its own shipping capacity and negotiated on surer footing in the Baltic. The Count's feud in Denmark provided the crucial break. When civil war engulfed Denmark in the mid-1530s, Gustav chose a measured intervention to curb Lübeck's dominance and to favor a stable Danish settlement under Christian III. Swedish ships sailed, coastal strongpoints were tested, and the balance of privileges shifted. When the dust settled, Lübeck's bargaining power had shrunk, and Sweden no longer faced the same humiliating dependence on Hanseatic credit. The lesson was absorbed into policy. A modest navy and timely diplomacy could keep the toll-takers honest and the kingdom solvent. Finance, however, is never only about ports. It is also about farms, forests, and mines. The crown's agents surveyed arable lands, counted taxable households, and indexed obligations in ledgers that allowed planners to forecast grain deliveries and coin receipts. Bergslagen's ironworks and the great copper mine at Falun received close attention. Smelting yards were inspected, transport routes were cleared, contracts for charcoal and ore were enforced. By building dependable flows from mine to market, Gustav raised steady income while supplying the material for cannon, shot, and tools, essentials for any power that wanted to be more than a local principality. The most serious challenge to this program erupted in Smoland with the Dacke War. Niels Dacke, a local leader with deep ties among peasants and smallholders, rallied resistance in the years we recall as 1542 to 1543. His followers protested heavier taxes, border tolls, and the crown's interference in parish life. They also defended older trading habits and hunting rights, threatened by the new order. The rebellion carved out a temporary zone of autonomy, set up blockades, and even issued proclamations in the king's voice. For a moment, the edifice of reform looked brittle. Gustav's response showed what a fiscal military state was meant to do. He reorganized forces for a sustained campaign, built temporary fieldworks, and used river lines and frozen roads to isolate rebel districts. He offered amnesties to fracture alliances and used targeted violence against ringleaders to sap will. Crucially, he learned from early setbacks and adjusted logistics, ensuring that troops were fed and paid. When royal arms prevailed, the crown did not simply punish. It redesigned the administrative map, strengthened garrisons, and placed trusted officials in sensitive posts. The cost was high, but the payoff was decisive. National policy would be made from Stockholm, not the forest commons. Religion threaded through these struggles in personal ways. Olaus Petri, once the bold voice of reform, clashed with the king over legal procedure and the limits of royal power. He and his ally Laurentius Andreae were tried and condemned, then later spared, a drama that revealed Gustav's balancing act. He needed the legitimacy that reformers gave him. Yet he would not allow preachers to define the pace or scope of change. The episode signaled to clergy and laity alike that theology would serve order, and that order would be defined at the palace and the chancery desk. Printed words gave the Reformation a durable anchor. In the year remembered as 1541, the Swedish Bible appeared, often called the Gustav Vasa Bible. Beyond its spiritual value, it cemented a standard written Swedish and aligned liturgy across the realm. Parish schools welcomed primers, and civic record-keeping gained a more uniform language. By fixing words, the crown fixed procedures, contracts, court rulings, and tax lists could now travel farther and be interpreted with fewer disputes. Language became an instrument of coherence, and coherence became an instrument of power. An enduring monarchy required stability in succession as much as in scripture. At Västerås again, in the year remembered as 1544, Gustav and the estates declared the monarchy hereditary in the Vasa line. This ended the cycle of emergency elections and regencies that had tempted foreign intervention. The decision also set expectations for a royal household that could plan long-term, fortify borders, cultivate arsenals, and train officials who served more than a single reign. With heredity established, the king could think in decades, not seasons. Castles and fortresses turned policy into stone. Old strongholds were repaired, and new works raised at bottlenecks on sea and land. At Vaxholm, guarding the approaches to Stockholm, and at Elfsborg, protecting the westward outlet, masonry and gun platforms projected the state's presence where customs were collected and fleets assembled. Inland, residences like Gripsholm were modernized to function as both symbols of authority and hubs of administration. Construction projects drew on local labor and materials, linking crown and community while circulating wages that then returned to the treasury as taxes. Militarily, Sweden in these decades did not yet field the disciplined machine that would later astonish Europe, but the roots were visible. Muster rolls improved. The crown experimented with more regular levies. Nobles were reminded of their obligations to furnish horse and men. The king purchased artillery, hired foreign gunners, and learned to coordinate field operations with naval movements in the archipelagos. Even limited wars, such as the testing conflict with Muscovy in the mid-1550s, forced improvements in supply and command that bureaucrats captured in manuals and memoranda for future campaigns. Law and courts kept pace with these changes. Royal statutes clarified who judged what and where appeals could be made. Sheriffs and bailiffs were held to written standards, and serious abuses drew royal ire. Town law improved the handling of debt, bankruptcy, and merchant disputes, making urban markets more predictable. In the countryside, parish structures integrated better with fiscal demands, as priests kept lists that doubled as tax records and conscription rolls. Authority was present not only in punishments, but in predictable procedure, which both constrained and empowered local communities. Diplomacy mirrored this careful pragmatism. Sweden cultivated a working peace with Denmark under its new settlement, kept lines open to Danzig and the Prussian ports, and probed for openings in Livonia without overreaching. Envoys offered trade privileges in exchange for recognition of Swedish autonomy in the north. The crown learned to leverage iron contracts to secure political goodwill, and foreign buyers learned that Swedish deliveries, while sometimes delayed by winter, could be trusted across years. Credit followed reliability, and reliability followed records, another loop in the chain-binding bureaucracy to power. Gustav Vasa's death left a tightened, wealth-conscious monarchy to his sons, and the eldest, Erik XIV, inherited a state with new tools and unfinished goals. Those tools were ledgers, musters, and fortified straits. The goal was influence along the Baltic Rim, where trade, tolls, and ports could turn a northern kingdom into a maritime power. Erik moved quickly from consolidation to assertion, convinced that Sweden's future lay not behind timbered walls, but on open water and in the contested towns of Livonia. The crown's new capacity would be tested in a theater far wider than the forests of Smoland. The spark was Livonia, where the old order had fractured under pressure from Muscovy and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Towns along the Gulf of Finland looked for patrons who could protect commerce without crushing autonomy. In this climate, the burghers of Reval, the city later known as Tallinn, swore allegiance to Sweden in the early 1560s, calculating that Stockholm's navy and money would keep Muscovite armies at bay. Erik recognized the opportunity. By anchoring a protectorate in northern Estonia, Sweden could flank the Gulf of Finland and open a path toward control of east-west trade. Denmark, Norway, and the Hanseatic city of Lübeck saw danger in this Swedish advance. The sound tolls collected by Copenhagen depended on keeping Sweden hemmed in, and Lübeck feared a rival for Baltic shipping. A quarrel over heraldic claims and maritime seizures soon escalated into the Northern Seven Years' War, a hard contest of blockades, raids, and set-piece clashes that raged from the mid-1560s into the end of that decade. Swedish fleets under admirals like Jakob Baga and later Claes Horn faced Danish squadrons led by Herluf Trolle and Norwegian commanders, while soldiers fought across Blekinge, Scania's outskirts, and the waters off Öland. The war's logic followed Sweden's new identity as a fiscal military state. The crown marshaled coin from customs and church lands, paid gunners and shipwrights, and pushed its navy into the Sound where tolls and prestige were at stake. Erik's ministers coordinated dockyards and timber supplies, turning Bergslagen's iron into anchors, guns, and shot. Naval victories gave Stockholm leverage, yet the sea remained contested, and Denmark held advantages in ship numbers and the geography of the straits. The conflict taught Swedish planners bitter lessons about logistics, command unity, and the risks of fighting at once on sea and land. At home, Erik's court grew tense. The very centralization that powered war also magnified the king's temperament. The infamous Stura murders, committed during a grim episode when the king's suspicions spiraled, shocked the nobility and undercut support in the officer corps. His half-brother, John, the Duke of Finland, already estranged by policy disputes and his marriage alliance with Poland-Lithuania, moved against him with the backing of nobles who feared arbitrary rule. The deposition came in the late 1560s, and Erik's fall served as a cautionary tale. An energetic war policy required a stable hand on the tiller. John III inherited both a war and a direction of travel. He and his council negotiated a peace with Denmark, Norway, and Lubeck at Stettin near the end of that decade, bringing the Northern 7 Years' War to a weary close. The treaty did not grant Sweden dramatic conquests, yet it secured breathing space and preserved what mattered: a foothold in Estonia, a navy still afloat, and a treasury learning to recover after prolonged strain. With the Western Front calmed, John turned eastward with steadier purpose, aiming to consolidate in Livonia without triggering another full-scale coalition against Stockholm. John's marriage to Catherine Jagiellon linked the Vasa line to the powerful Jagiellonian dynasty of Poland-Lithuania, and that union resonated in both diplomacy and religion. The king showed sympathy for a ceremonially rich liturgy and commissioned reforms that edged Swedish worship closer to older forms. The Red Book, his liturgical compromise, aimed to reconcile evangelical teaching with traditional rites. This was not a retreat from the Reformation settlement established under his father. It was an attempt to stabilize a society still adjusting to new doctrines while smoothing relations with a Catholic great power next door. The experiment would later provoke resistance from a younger brother, Duke Karl of Södermanland, who championed austere Lutheranism. In Livonia, the calculus was straightforward. Ports, fortresses, and roads determined revenue and power. Swedish commanders and engineers, supported by a maturing bureaucracy, sought to knit Reval's allegiance to a chain of strongpoints stretching east toward Narva. The enemy was Muscovy, where Tsar Ivan, remembered as Ivan the Terrible, had pressed the crumbling Livonian order for years. Field leaders like Pontus de la Gardie combined siegecraft and swift marches to peel towns away from Muscovite control. When Narva fell to Swedish arms in the early 1580s, the crown gained not only a gateway to the Russian market, but also a customs point that could finance further campaigns. The capture of Narva rippled across the Baltic. Merchants from Stockholm and German ports recalibrated trade routes. Danzig watched warily as Sweden promised secure passage for goods that once moved through Polish-Lithuanian channels. Muscovy, harried on multiple fronts, grudgingly accepted a truce along the Plusa River that confirmed Swedish possession of key eastern fortresses. For Stockholm, this was more than cartography. It meant that the fiscal military engine built in Gustav's time could now draw fuel from ports beyond the old Scandinavian heartland. The state's reach had become truly Baltic. John's court kept one eye on Livonia and another on the kingdom's interior. The navy that had struggled during the long war against Denmark was reorganized with tighter discipline. Dockyards at Stockholm and Åbo repaired weathered hulls and laid new keels, while ordnance officers standardized calibers to simplify supply at sea. The officer corps broadened with a mix of Swedish nobles and foreign professionals who brought maritime skills from the North Sea world. Naval doctrine shifted toward convoy protection and coastal control, tasks that suited a realm seeking to secure a trade empire rather than to conquer the Danish straits outright. The crown's legal and fiscal gears turned in step. In newly held Estonian districts, Swedish law and administration were introduced with careful promises to local elites. Town charters were confirmed to encourage commerce under the Swedish flag, while tax registers were adapted to the realities of Baltic estates and German-speaking burghers. The lesson from Smolen's rebellion a generation earlier had been learned. Durable authority required predictable rules. In practice, that meant trained officials who could translate decrees into municipal practice, and it meant patience when adapting Stockholm's system to a polyglot frontier. Strategically, Sweden now straddled two delicate balances. Toward the west, it had to avoid reawakening Danish fears while still guarding the approaches to Stockholm and Gothenburg. Toward the east, it had to hold a line against Muscovy without convincing Poland-Lithuania that Sweden sought to dominate all Livonia. Here, marriage ties and church policy intersected with gunnery and grain supply. John's liturgical moderation soothed some Catholic suspicions, while his readiness to negotiate separate peaces reflected the hard arithmetic of a mid-sized power. Choose enemies sparingly and secure revenue sources before chasing glory. Yet the royal household itself carried seeds of future conflict. John's son, Sigismund, raised in a court shaped by Catherine Jagiellon's faith, embodied a potential union of Swedish and Polish crowns under a Catholic prince. To some magnates, this promised continental stature and a dynastic solution to Baltic rivalry. To Lutherans, especially the circle around Duke Karl, it threatened the work of reformation and the balance of power between crown and estates. The court managed these tensions while John lived, but the debate over succession was already shaping alliances in Stockholm and in the provincial diets. On the ground in Livonia, Swedish soldiers and engineers refined methods that would later blossom into the celebrated Swedish way of war. They learned to move artillery along bad roads with organized teams, to winter garrisons in captured towns without alienating burghers, and to use shallow draft craft to shuttle men and supplies along coasts and rivers. Reports from these campaigns fed the chancery with practical knowledge: how much bread a company consumed in winter, how often wheels broke on certain routes, how quickly a fortress surrendered when its water supply was cut. War became a ledger of experience as much as a test of arms. Culturally, the era brought a cautious cosmopolitanism to Sweden's elites. Contacts in Revel and Narva linked Stockholm to German, Dutch, and Scottish mercantile worlds. Masters of mint and cannon founders from abroad took contracts, and foreign printers helped circulate both devotional texts and administrative manuals. This traffic of skills reinforced the crown's broader strategy: integrate into European markets enough to finance defense, but hold policy independence by diversifying partners. The Baltic was not a lake, it was a marketplace, and Sweden at last had stalls in more than one port. The peace with Denmark did not erase rivalry. Skirmishes and diplomatic tugs continued over border questions in Blekinge and Holland, and over the etiquette of salutes and flags at sea. Yet the absence of total war allowed Stockholm to invest in docks, warehouses, and coastal fortifications rather than rebuild burnt farmsteads year after year. Coastal communities felt both the taxman's hand and the Navy's protection, a duality that defined the fiscal military state everywhere in early modern Europe. Consent was not asked. It was negotiated through predictable burdens and visible benefits. When John III died, the crown of Sweden passed to his son, Sigismund, already elected king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This union of crowns looked impressive on a map, but it was fragile in practice. Sweden had anchored its identity in Lutheran faith, while Sigismund III was a devout Catholic shaped by Krakow and Vilnius. The question was simple and explosive. Could a Catholic monarch rule a Lutheran realm without remaking its church or surrendering its sovereignty to policies formed abroad? The first answer came not from battle lines, but from a church assembly. In Uppsala, Swedish clergy and nobles gathered for a synod in the early months after Sigismund's accession. They affirmed the Augsburg Confession, rejected the liturgical experiments of the late reign, and declared Lutheran doctrine the settled faith of the kingdom. This was more than theology, it was constitutional. By fixing religion, the estates fixed the terms under which they would accept a distant and Catholic king. Sigismund traveled to Sweden with promises of tolerance and with counselors drawn from both his Polish court and Swedish loyalists. He accepted coronation under conditions that pledged respect for the Uppsala settlement and for the estate's rights. Yet the royal instinct to appoint trusted men, to honor Catholic allies, and to moderate Lutheran rigor soon clashed with local expectations. Each appointment and each dispensation looked to Swedish eyes like a foot pressed against the door they had just barred. In this climate, Duke Karl of Södermanland stepped from wary prince to Protestant standard-bearer. Younger brother to the late king, Karl had long favored plain Lutheran worship and tighter oversight of royal officials. He now styled himself defender of the Uppsala order and spokesman for a national cause that fused faith with self-government. His strength came not only from noble allies, but from townsmen and clergy who feared a slow slide back toward Rome and foreign influence. Political friction became institutional paralysis. Sigismund needed regular diets to levy taxes and pass ordinances, but the estates would not move without assurances that stuck beyond ceremony. The king lingered more in Poland than in Stockholm, a necessity for governing the larger commonwealth, but a provocation to Swedish sensibilities. In his absence, Karl and the council managed routine affairs and framed their stewardship as guardianship of law rather than rebellion. The longer this provisional order held, the more legitimate it looked. Fault lines hardened over control of fortresses and the appointment of governors in the eastern Baltic. Sigismund sought to place loyalists in key Livonian and Finnish posts, arguing that coherent defense required unified command. Karl countered that Swedish garrisons must remain in Lutheran and nationally minded hands. Both sides prepared quietly, calling in favors, provisioning stores, and testing the loyalty of captains whose futures depended on choosing the winning side at the right time. The first open crack came in the port towns, where news and rumor traveled fast. In cities across Finland and along the Baltic Rim, councils debated oaths while merchants calculated risk. Karl's letters emphasized the Uppsala decrees and warned of creeping innovations. Sigismund's agents promised order under the rightful king. Street by street, ship by ship, the political struggle became a contest of sermons, proclamations, and watch lists. War flared when words could no longer contain the issue. Sigismund landed with a Polish-Lithuanian contingent and Swedish loyalists, aiming to assert direct authority and strip Karl of his provisional command. The campaign that followed was swift and decisive. At the fields near Stångebro, forces loyal to Karl blocked the royal advance. Battle settled the argument that paper had not, and Sigismund's position collapsed as quickly as it had formed. Defeat on the field opened the way to a legal reckoning. The estates declared that Sigismund had violated his coronation promises and failed to maintain the kingdom's laws and confession. He was deposed from the Swedish throne, though he still ruled in Poland-Lithuania. The crown's guardianship fell to Karl, first as regent acting in the name of the realm, and soon with the substance of royal authority. A dynastic link that had promised continental reach was severed by a confessional line drawn at Uppsala and defended at Stångebro. What followed is remembered in Sweden as the Linköping bloodbath, a chilling emblem of the new order's resolve. Several high nobles who had stood with Sigismund were condemned and executed after formal proceedings. The message was unmistakable. Treason was not a matter of courtly misfortune, but of capital law. The axe confirmed what the Diet had written, and the army had won. A Protestant state would have a Protestant ruling house, and loyalty would be measured in deeds, not lineage. Karl's regency and early kingship were consumed by two tasks, both urgent. He had to consolidate the Lutheran settlement at home and to defend Swedish gains in the Baltic against a now hostile Commonwealth. He tightened supervision of bishops, confirmed the authority of consistories, and kept the Uppsala Articles as the measuring stick for sermons, schools, and parish life. At the same time, he mobilized resources for a war that shifted swiftly from dynastic dispute to interstate contest. The conflict in Livonia broadened and deepened. Sigismund, still king in Krakow and Warsaw, framed the struggle as a rightful effort to reclaim his Swedish crown and to secure Livonian towns from usurpers. Karl framed it as national defense against foreign aggression blessed by Rome. Commanders on both sides learned the ugly arithmetic of Baltic warfare: sieges in damp fortresses, supply lines beaten into mud, and winters that ate men and horses with equal impartiality. Towns changed hands not once, but several times, each transfer leaving scars in law and memory. Swedish administration adapted to the pressures of constant campaigning. Muster rolls were kept with closer attention, and field magazines were stocked so that armies could move before spring thaws. The government increased coordination between navy and army, using shallow draft craft to feed sieges and evacuate wounded. Though Sweden's population was modest, Karl squeezed more fighting power from it by stricter organization and by binding provincial elites to the war through contracts and rewards. War, once again, trained the bureaucracy that sustained it. Diplomacy remained a second front. Karl courted Protestant allies in the empire and kept careful distance from Denmark, whose rulers watched Swedish troubles with interest. He traded messages with Moscow during the time of troubles, weighing whether a partnership against the Commonwealth could yield strategic gains in Ingria and Karelia. Every letter, every envoy, sat atop calculations about ports, customs, and the cost of garrisons. Ideology mattered, but geography and revenue set the boundaries of what could be promised and what could be delivered. At home, the estates found their footing within the new regime. Many nobles had bled for Karl and expected consideration. Many towns had armed militias and expected charters. The king balanced grants with reductions, favor with scrutiny. He needed a loyal elite, but he also needed a solvent treasury and an obedient army. The solution was the old Swedish habit sharpened by new necessities: write it down, count it out, and enforce it through officials who owed their chair to the crown. Confessional policy hardened without theatrics. Jesuit influence was pushed out. Catholic worship was restricted where it had crept in during the dynastic interlude. Parish visitations ensured that pulpits preached the settled creed, and schools taught a catechism that wove obedience to law into obedience to faith. Yet there was also restraint. Karl remembered that civil peace had been restored not by a purge of consciences, but by a common agreement on public worship and governance. Private belief was not the quarry, public order was. The wars with the Commonwealth did not end quickly. Campaigns took and lost towns whose names filled columns in chancery books and grief in Livonian homes. Swedish hopes were buoyed by victories on secondary fronts and by the Commonwealth's own distractions. Still, it was clear by the end of Karl's reign that Sweden needed more than stout hearts and careful ledgers to master the Baltic. It needed a reimagined army, lighter on its feet, quicker to concentrate force, and commanded with unity and nerve. Gustavus Adolphus came to the throne during a war he did not choose, and a crisis he could not postpone. Denmark pressed along Sweden's southern rim, and the Commonwealth shadowed Livonia, while Russia probed at the eastern marches. The young king's first task was survival. His second was transformation. He would rebuild Sweden's armies, finances, and administration so that the realm could decide its own wars, rather than have them decided for it. The story of these years is not only about victories, it is about building the machine that made victories possible. The war with Denmark, remembered as the Kalmar War, forced hard choices. Christian IV understood that Sweden's rise threatened the tolls and prestige of Copenhagen. Battles and sieges along the southern coast drained Swedish coffers. When peace came at Knäred in the year we recall as 1613, the price for restoring the fortress of Elfsborg was a massive ransom in silver. Pain became policy. To pay the charge swiftly, the crown levied extraordinary taxes across estates and parishes, proving that a disciplined fiscal state could squeeze out cash on a schedule. The lesson would be used again and again. Gustavus did not rule alone. Axel Oxenstierna, appointed chancellor in the year remembered as 1612, became the architect of an administrative order that matched the king's battlefield reforms. Together, they organized the realm into functional colleges for war, admiralty, treasury, and chancellery, each with rules, clerks, and ledgers. Orders flowed faster, money moved more predictably, and audits bit deeper. A crown that could not depend on sheer numbers would depend on procedure, training, and speed. The Swedish habit of writing, counting, and enforcing became a system. Peace with Russia at Stolbovo in the year remembered as 1617 gave Sweden a strategic gift. By securing Ingria and Kexholm, the treaty walled Muscovy off from the Baltic. The map now showed Swedish strongpoints from the Gulf of Finland through Narva into the approaches of the Neva. The gain was not only territory, it was time. Without a Muscovite outlet to the sea, Stockholm could focus on Poles and Danes, and it could plan for a Baltic future in which Swedish customs and convoys mattered more each year. Diplomacy had achieved what fortresses alone could not. At home, the military revolution gathered speed. Gustavus reorganized infantry into brigades that blended pikes and muskets in lighter, more flexible formations. He drilled companies to deliver close, fast salvos rather than staggered, slow fire. He cut down the weight of artillery so that field guns could march with the line, and he trained gunners to redeploy rapidly in the middle of action. The goal was simple: put more controlled violence on a chosen point sooner than the enemy expected. Doctrine traveled through printed regulations, relentless inspections, and the king's own presence on parade grounds and in camps. Cavalry changed character as well. Instead of relying on prolonged caracole maneuvers with pistols, Swedish horse were taught to close quickly, fire once if needed, and then break into the enemy with cold steel. The shock of a disciplined charge at the right moment could shatter a line already shaken by concentrated volleys and mobile guns. Officers were ordered to lead from the front and to keep a reserve for decisive strikes. The message from the king was constant: attack with purpose, regroup with speed, and trust the drill. All of this demanded men and money. Gustavus advanced the organization of provincial regiments, linking units to districts so that training, equipment, and replacements could flow with less friction. The system was not yet the later allotment scheme, but its logic was visible. Bind military service to local structures so that musters are reliable and desertion less tempting. Meanwhile, Oxenstierna's treasury matched obligations to income, spreading payments across the year and using credit carefully to cover seasonal gaps. The crown had learned the hard way during the Elfsborg ransom that delay costs more than discipline. The Baltic theater renewed pressure with new opportunities. In Livonia, Swedish forces pushed against the Commonwealth's defenses while guarding the ports that had been the prize of earlier campaigns. The great capture of Riga in the year remembered as 1621 was a turning point. Riga became a jewel in the Swedish maritime crown, a city whose customs and warehouses could fund the fleet and the garrisons that protected it. The port tied Sweden into wider European markets, with a directness that Stockholm had long sought and rivals had feared. Seizing Riga required not only assault ladders, but also logistics. Swedish commanders prepositioned magazines of bread, powder, and shot. Shallow draft vessels ferried supplies along rivers and coasts, and engineers mapped approaches and built works with clockwork patience. Reports from the siege show the new method: measure, test, adjust, and attack where the enemy's line is weak. After Riga, other Baltic towns watched Swedish operations with a different eye, seeing not a northern upstart but a power that combined political will with a dependable method. Across the Scandinavian interior, Gustavus bound the fiscal and military reforms to infrastructure. Roads and bridges on key routes were repaired so that artillery and wagons could keep pace with infantry on campaign. Fortresses at Vaxholm and Elfsborg received upgrades, and new works rose at Nya Elfsborg to secure the westward outlet. The crown also refounded Gothenburg on a more secure site in the year we recall as 1621, creating a western port that offered access to the North Sea beyond Danish tolls. Geography was being rewritten by masonry, ditches, and planned harbors. The Navy absorbed steady attention. Shipwrights standardized hull types and rigging in royal yards, while the Admiralty College stocked rope, sailcloth, and timber on schedules designed to avoid bottlenecks. Gunnery practice became regular, and captains were instructed in convoy tactics that made trade protection more reliable than it had been in earlier wars. The Crown's goal was control, not mere presence. A navy that could shepherd exports and intercept threats would multiply the value of every customs house from Stockholm to Riga. War with the Commonwealth intensified through the 1620s. Polish hetmans remained formidable, and the Commonwealth's elite cavalry posed real challenges. Swedish commanders adjusted by anchoring infantry with field fortifications, coordinating fire and movement with greater care, and using the navy to threaten coastal strongpoints and supply enemy forces. Gains came slowly but steadily. Towns such as Tartu, known then as Dorpat, felt the pressure of a siege system that mixed science with stubbornness. Even setbacks became lessons folded into new regulations and drills. Politics remained the hidden engine. The Riksdag was consulted frequently to keep extraordinary taxes legitimate, and the estates were reminded that new ports and safe trade routes returned benefits in coin and employment. Oxenstierna pursued contracts with foreign merchants that promised reliable purchase of iron and copper, smoothing revenues across seasons. To recruit specialists, the Crown welcomed officers and artisans from the German lands, Scotland, and the Dutch Republic, integrating them into a Swedish framework that expected obedience to written orders above all. Ideas mattered too. Gustavus sponsored military manuals that embedded his reforms in print so they could outlast any single campaign. He promoted chaplains who taught a moral code of discipline, sobriety, and duty, making the army a school of nationhood as well as a fighting force. The dignity of common soldiers rose with the expectations placed upon them. Pay was still hard to guarantee in every month, but arrears were tracked, and compensation promised with more honesty than had been common in earlier decades. The army's culture tightened, and so did its pride. As the war ground on, Stockholm looked south to the Prussian coast, where the Commonwealth held rich ports. The Swedish aim was straightforward: cut enemy revenues and open another stream for itself. Campaigns along the Vistula Delta pressured the lifelines of the Commonwealth and placed Swedish squadrons astride trade routes to the sea. The Truce of Altmark in the year we remember as 1629 rewarded endurance. Sweden gained control of key Prussian ports such as Elbing and secured the lion's share of customs from much of the Prussian coastline, excluding a few great exceptions. For a set number of years, those tolls would flow into Swedish coffers, underwriting the very fleet and garrisons that had made them possible. Altmark's significance went beyond money. By standing astride the southern Baltic, Sweden became the broker of safe passage for merchants from the Low Countries, England, and the German towns. Diplomatic channels widened as commercial ties deepened. Rivals took note. Denmark grasped that the Öresund tolls now had a competitor, and the Habsburgs measured the rise of a Protestant power that could move armies by sea and fund them with customs from multiple shores. Sweden had not yet intervened in the wider German war, but the stage was being built plank by plank. The human strain of this transformation remained real. Peasants complained of levies and billets. Merchants measured profit against new obligations. Noble families calculated service at court against duty in the field. Gustavus and Oxenstierna responded with a rhythm of consultation and enforcement. The estates were heard, and then the policy proceeded. When mistakes were made, the Crown sometimes corrected course publicly, a practice that shored up credibility. In the long run, habits of compliance formed because the state kept records, met deadlines, and punished corruption as well as desertion. Gustavus Adolphus crossed the Baltic not as a raider, but as the head of a retooled state. The Swedish landing in Pomerania in the summer of the year, remembered as 1630, followed a formal pact with Duke Bogislaw XIV, the last Griffin ruler. That agreement, often called the Capitulation of Stettin, allowed Swedish garrisons and gave the crown control of key ports and fortresses. The aim was clear and limited at first: secure a Baltic shield, deny hostile fleets a foothold, and bargain from strength in the German war already raging far to the south. Context mattered. The Habsburg Emperor had issued the Edict of Restitution, seeking to roll back Protestant gains, and Imperial and Catholic League armies had made strong advances. Cities feared confiscations and new garrisons. Princes feared loss of authority. Sweden presented itself as a Protestant protector and a maritime partner. The king promised pay, discipline, and defense of local rights. Behind those promises stood the fiscal machine built at home and the customs revenue secured by the truce on the southern Baltic coast. Sweden could now wage war abroad without leaving its own ports naked. French diplomacy added the last ingredient. At Bärwalde in early 1631, Cardinal Richelieu's crown agreed to subsidize the Swedish army so long as it fought the Habsburgs and respected certain German liberties. Sweden remained staunchly Lutheran and France staunchly Catholic, yet their interests aligned against imperial overreach. The treaty converted Swedish method into sustained action. Subsidies provided coin on a timetable. Swedish administration transformed coin into powder, bread, and pay. Strategy turned on logistics, and logistics turned on ledgers. The campaign opened with caution. Swedish columns secured the Oder line, laid out depot networks, and rebuilt harbors so that supplies could move faster by water than by road. Engineers strengthened ramparts at Stettin and other Pomeranian towns, while light troops felt for enemy outposts. Gustavus avoided deep thrusts before allies were ready. He courted northern German princes and the towns of the Hanseatic world, explaining that Sweden sought neither annexation nor confessional coercion, only a balance that would keep the Baltic open and the emperor out of northern affairs. Then came the shock that changed calculations across the empire. In the spring of 1631, imperial and League forces under the Count of Tilly stormed Magdeburg after a long siege. The city burned, thousands died, Europe shuddered. News and rumor outpaced couriers carrying images of charred streets and shattered churches. The sack did not directly touch Swedish troops, yet it reframed Gustavus's mission in the eyes of wavering Protestants. The Swedish camp could now ask a direct question of every prince and magistrate: who will stand idle after Magdeburg? Elector John George of Saxony answered by joining Sweden. With Saxon levies marching beside Swedish brigades, Gustavus found the numbers he needed to seek a decisive field battle. The place was the plain near Breitenfeld, north of Leipzig, in the late summer of 1631. Tilly's veterans formed deep Catholic League tercios. The Swedes deployed in lighter brigades with mobile guns ready to wheel and strike. When the Saxon line broke under pressure, the Swedish right held firm, counterattacked, and rolled up the enemy flank with coordinated fire and cavalry shock. The result was a sweeping victory that tore away the aura of invincibility around League infantry. Breitenfeld's meaning was strategic and symbolic. Strategically, the road into central Germany lay open. Symbolically, the Swedish method had proven itself against the toughest opponent in the theater. Towns that had hesitated now calculated again, balancing imperial demands against a Swedish army that paid better, looted less, and could win in the open. Gustavus advanced with measured speed, repairing bridges, gathering contributions, and binding local officials to written terms for quartering and supply. The army moved as an organized community rather than a swarm, and that difference won allies as surely as cannon did. The next thrust aimed at the heart of Catholic Bavaria. Gustavus crossed the Lech River in early 1632, using a masked artillery barrage and entrenchments to force a dangerous passage. Tilly was mortally wounded in the defense, and the League army reeled back. The Swedes entered Augsburg and then Munich, where they seized arsenals and negotiated contributions that replenished their magazines. The advance showed that the Danube line could be turned, and it sent a cold message to courts from Vienna to Madrid. A Baltic crown now dictated terms in the south. Victory drew new dangers. The emperor recalled Albrecht von Wallenstein, the only commander with the autonomy and vision to rebuild imperial fortunes. Wallenstein raised a vast army and adopted a counter-strategy that matched Swedish mobility with operational cunning. He avoided rash battle and instead built entrenched camps, cut supply lines, and threatened Gustavus's gains by maneuver rather than by frontal assault. Near Nuremberg, both sides constructed enormous fieldworks and faced each other in a war of attrition. Disease and supply shortages bit hard. Gustavus attacked at the Alta Vesta to break the stalemate, but withdrew after a punishing fight that yielded little. This setback did not undo the broader Swedish advance, but it forced the king to reassess. He lifted his sights from Bavaria and moved to block Wallenstein in Saxony, where electoral loyalties and supply corridors could not be lost without dissolving the alliance that had made Breitenfeld possible. The march northward was swift. In early winter, the two armies groped for advantage across cold fields and fog-soaked roads. Wallenstein dispersed parts of his force for winter quarters around Leipzig and Lützen, calculating that Gustavus would not press hard so late in the season. The Swedish king disagreed. At Lützen in mid-November of 1632, the armies finally met in battle. Morning fog and smoke from damp fields shrouded the lines. The Swedes pushed against strong positions anchored by sunken roads and hastily fortified villages. Mobile guns hammered gaps. Brigades advanced with their practiced volleys. Cavalry under Lennart Torstensson and other lieutenants sought the enemy's open flanks. The fight swayed back and forth. During a charge on the Swedish right, Gustavus rode forward in poor visibility and was killed in the confusion. Command passed to his officers, who steadied the line, repulsed a fierce imperial counterattack led by Gottfried Pappenheim, and clung to the field as darkness fell. Lützen was a Swedish victory at a terrible cost. The imperial army retreated, leaving cannon and standards behind. But Sweden lost the king whose energy had animated the entire project. On the field, soldiers mourned. In camp, officers met to keep order. In Stockholm, councillors faced a future they had prepared for but dreaded. The army remained intact and still commanded the loyalty of German allies. Yet the charisma and drive of Gustavus could not be replaced by any single figure. The solution, in Swedish fashion, would be institutional. Axel Oxenstierna stepped into the foreground as chancellor, guardian of the minor Queen Christina, and coordinator of the coalition. He convened allied princes, negotiated systems of contributions, and worked to engrave Sweden's new status into the political structure of the empire. The goal was to turn battlefield presence into a legal and financial order that paid the troops and secured rights of garrison and passage. Oxenstierna founded administration on paper and procedure, just as he had at home. The Swedish state would not recede merely because its king had fallen. Why these years mattered is not found only in battles, but in the knitting together of means and ends. Sweden proved that a northern power with a disciplined army, a credible navy, and careful finances could shape the grand struggles of Central Europe. The alliance with France showed that confessional labels did not dictate policy when reason of state was at stake. The liberation of Protestant territories from League control gave teeth to a cause with deep roots in German towns and principalities. In treaties and diets, the name of Sweden now commanded attention and fear. Human textures ran through all this strategy. German villagers saw a new kind of camp discipline and sometimes kinder quartering, though hardship was never absent. City councils bargained with Swedish commissioners who kept orderly books and demanded punctual deliveries. Swedish soldiers wrote home about churches and fields far from their lakes and pines, while chaplains tried to keep faith and order in tents and billets. Even adversaries recognized the difference. Wallenstein and his generals spoke with respect of a foe that marched and fought with clockwork intent. When the smoke cleared after Lützen, Sweden faced a test no victory could postpone: how to carry a continental war without the king who had led it. The answer took an institutional shape. Axel Oxenstierna, as chancellor and guardian of the young Queen Christina, gathered generals and German allies and made the case that Sweden's strength lay in method, rules, accounts, and coordinated command. He forged a framework that would keep armies fed and allies aligned, while Stockholm learned to speak as a great power in councils as confidently as it did on battlefields. The first step was political. In the German lands, Oxenstierna convened Protestant princes and city envoys at Heilbronn and asked them to bind their hopes to Swedish arms in return for protection and a share in contributions collected from recaptured territories. This alliance gave Sweden legitimacy beyond mere might. It told towns from the Main to the Elbe that the Northern Crown would defend their liberties while keeping soldiers in order. The Chancellor's promise rested on the engine built at home. Colleges for war and finance, inspectors who counted what they demanded, and officers who obeyed printed regulations. War, however, has its own weather. Imperial fortunes revived after the return of Wallenstein and the mustering of fresh League contingents. The hammer blow fell near Nördlingen in late summer of 1634, where a Spanish imperial army shattered Swedish and Allied ranks on steep ground. The loss cut deep. Southern German allies peeled away, and the emperor drew hesitant Protestant princes into the broad peace called the Treaty of Prague. What Sweden had built through Breitenfeld and Augsburg now seemed in danger of contraction. Oxenstierna refused despair, turning to the one partner who wanted Habsburg power checked as much as Sweden did. That partner was France. Under Cardinal Richelieu and later Cardinal Mazarin, Paris converted subsidies into open war against the Habsburgs. The conflict widened, but it also stabilized Sweden's position. French forces pulled imperial attention to the Rhine and the Spanish road, while Swedish armies regrouped under commanders who had studied Gustavus's methods and adapted them to new foes. Johan Bonnier and later Lennart Torstensson brought mobility and calculation back to the forefront, proving that the Swedish way of war could survive its creator. While continental campaigns resumed, Stockholm refined the state that sustained them. The instrument of government issued in the mid-1630s codified the collegiate system of central administration. It defined the War College, the Admiralty, the Chancery, and the Chamber, and it placed written procedure above personal whim. This did not make Sweden a modern bureaucracy overnight, but it did draw a clear map from policy to port, from statute to storehouse. In practice, it meant that contributions levied in Saxon towns or Pomeranian villages arrived as usable coin, powder, and bread for field armies. Baner's return to form showed in Saxony and along the Elbe, where Swedish columns regained key crossings and outmaneuvered imperial forces that had grown complacent. His sudden death on campaign might have broken momentum, yet the system held. Torstensson took command, and with him came a rapid series of marches that confounded opponents who expected winter quarters rather than winter offensives. The Swedish army, lighter in artillery and stricter in drill than many foes, struck where magazines and bridges had been quietly prepared. War became logistics in motion. One of Torstensson's boldest moves was to open a new front against Denmark. Relations with Copenhagen had simmered for years, and the Danish crown still controlled the straits that taxed northern trade. In the early 1640s, Torstensson's columns swept into Jutland while Swedish squadrons harried the Danish fleet. The campaign ended at Brömsebro with terms that shifted the balance of the north. Sweden gained landscapes along the central spine of Scandinavia, secured islands vital to Baltic control, and, most importantly, pried open trade advantages that weakened the grip of the Sound tolls. Each clause translated into fewer obstacles for Swedish ships and steadier revenues for Swedish treasurers. Meanwhile, Torstensson circled back to the empire and delivered a crushing victory at Jankau in Bohemia. The win broke imperial plans to roll back Swedish positions and reopened the road toward Vienna, even if supply lines later forced caution. The larger truth was plain. Sweden could still choose the place and tempo of battle, and it could still move artillery as if it were cavalry. Reports from imperial officers spoke of the frustrating speed with which Swedish brigades shifted from column to line and brought guns into action before their foes had set their positions. All of this fighting aimed at leverage in a peace that would not merely stop the shooting but remake the map. Negotiations gathered at Münster and Osnabrück, the twin towns that would host the Peace of Westphalia. Sweden sent seasoned diplomats, among them Johan Oxenstierna and Johan Adler Salvius, who knew the value of coastal towns and river mouths as well as the value of confessional guarantees. The Swedish brief was precise. Secure money to pay the army's arrears, secure territory that anchored sea lanes and tolls, and secure legal standing within the empire that recognized Sweden as more than a hired sword. At home, Queen Christina came of age and took the reins of a court that tilted toward learning and display. She drew scholars and artists to Stockholm, funded a famous library, and turned the capital into a northern salon. Culture was not a distraction from policy, it was a statement. A realm that had learned to govern by statutes and supply schedules now claimed a place in the Republic of Letters. Yet her spending and her generosity to favorites strained the treasury, and her impatience with marriage unsettled noble houses that wanted the succession secured. The tension between brilliance and solvency would shape the end of her reign. In the Baltic provinces and the German enclaves already under Swedish control, administrators tested how to transplant Stockholm's order into diverse societies. In Pomerania and in the bishoprics seized during the war, officials introduced Swedish law, where practical and respected local customs where prudent. Urban charters were confirmed to keep commerce lively, and parish structures were nudged toward Lutheran discipline without tearing at German sensibilities already worn thin by decades of conflict. The crown's aim was not to homogenize but to standardize what mattered: taxes, tolls, garrisons, and courts. The treaties signed in the late 1640s crowned this long labor. Sweden received western Pomerania with strategic river mouths, the Baltic port of Wismar, and the secularized territories of Bremen and Verden along the North Sea. With them came seats and votes in the imperial estates, a formal voice in the German constitution that could be used to block rivals and protect trade. The settlements also awarded substantial sums to pay arrears, recognizing that armies do not simply vanish when pens are set to parchment. By turning battlefield victories into legal titles and income streams, Sweden created what contemporaries called an empire of coasts and customs. These gains required a navy strong enough to knit scattered holdings together. The admiralty kept yards busy and inventories full, focusing on hull types suited to the shallow approaches of Baltic and North Sea harbors. Convoys linked Bremen's river to Pomerania's inlets, while customs officers kept shared ledgers that showed how coin gathered in German towns traveled to pay Swedish regiments and sailors. The web held so long as ships sailed on time, and captains obeyed instructions that prioritized protection over show. It was a maritime policy of patience, and it paid. Yet success carried problems of its own. Garrison costs bled the treasury even when no shots were fired, and Swedish officials faced the classic imperial dilemma: how to police distant enclaves without provoking resentment that made policing costlier. Oxenstierna urged economies and reductions in noble land grants that had ballooned during the war, while court factions lobbied for pensions and honors. The Riksdag heard petitions from peasants burdened by billets and from merchants worried that prolonged military presence would smother the very trade meant to fund it. Sweden had won an empire, and now it had to learn to keep one. Queen Christina's restless mind and taste for grand gestures eventually collided with these hard accounts. Drawn to philosophy and unconvinced that dynastic motherhood was her path, she planned an abdication that would transfer the crown to her cousin, the able soldier Charles Gustav, while freeing her to pursue a different life. The decision unfolded with ceremony, but also with calculation. By choosing a successor steeped in war and administration, she and the council hoped the realm's new holdings would be secured by a firm hand, even as the courtly culture she had fostered took wing in memory rather than in policy. Before her abdication, Christina oversaw one more assertion of Swedish leverage in the north. Denmark, still a wary neighbor, found that the earlier settlement had not ended rivalry. Swedish diplomacy pressed advantages without open war, reminding Copenhagen that any attempt to reverse gains would meet a navy and an army seasoned by continental struggle. The balance was delicate but real. The straits could no longer be treated as a Danish toll gate alone, and Sweden stood as co-guardian of the northern passages. The Peace of Westphalia closed one kind of conflict and opened another, the quiet contest of administration. Swedish governors in Bremen-Verden argued with local estates about dues. Pomeranian towns tested the limits of Swedish oversight. Rival powers probed for weak points in the new order. The Crown's answer returned to first principles. Keep the accounts honest, rotate officers before they become local barons, and ensure that every garrison commander can call a ship to his harbor within days, not weeks. Sea power gave the system coherence. Paperwork gave it memory. In human terms, the period reshaped lives on both sides of the Baltic. German burghers learned to read ordinances stamped with 3 crowns, and Swedish clerks learned to spell town names that had never before crossed their desks. Merchants sold hemp and tar for rigging, iron for guns, and grain for garrisons, binding rural Sweden to city markets in Germany. Chaplains preached unity of faith across languages, while jurists reconciled Swedish statutes with imperial law. Everyday habits followed the new circuits of coin and command. Charles the Tenth. Gustav took the crown from Queen Christina's hands with a soldier's impatience and a planner's map. He inherited an empire of coasts and votes, but also garrisons that ate money and rivals who waited for a misstep. His answer was audacity. He would convert scattered leverage into decisive advantage, striking first where opponents were divided and moving so quickly that coalitions could not form against him. The stage was the Baltic. The first act was the Commonwealth, weakened by Russian invasion and internal strain. Sweden's machine, built over decades, was about to run at full speed. The invasion of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth began in the summer remembered as 1655. Charles aimed to topple the balance in one campaign by seizing the Vistula corridor, capturing customs, and forcing a political settlement that favored Swedish commerce. At Uistje, Polish levies capitulated. At Kiedani, Lithuanian magnates under Janusz Radziwiłł aligned with the Swedish king against their own crown. Stockholm presented itself as guarantor of noble liberties and guardian of trade. The message worked while fear ruled, and Swedish columns swept into Greater Poland and then to Krakow with astonishing momentum. Speed produced success, and success produced overreach. Swedish administrators imposed contributions to feed garrisons and finance the push toward the southeast. Towns paid, villages suffered, resentment grew. The siege of the monastery at Jasna Gora became a rallying point for resistance, mixing piety with patriotism. King John Casimir rallied forces and called on the peasantry. Swedish officers discovered that holding a great plain required more than winning in cities. It required escorting convoys across hostile countryside and replacing the political structures they had broken. Charles adapted with new alliances and calculated risks. He drew Brandenburg, Prussia into his camp, signing at Königsberg a pact that bound the great elector, Frederick William, to Swedish arms in exchange for recognition of his local ambitions. Brandenburg troops marched beside Swedish brigades, and together they faced Polish forces in the 3-day Battle of Warsaw in the summer remembered as 1656. The Swedes and their ally won the field through coordinated volleys and cavalry shock, pushing the Commonwealth back and keeping the Vistula crossings in Swedish hands, at least for a time. Victory on the Vistula did not end the war. Moscow watched and moved. With Poland reeling, Russia struck at Swedish Livonia and Ingria in a separate contest that forced Charles to divide attention and troops. Meanwhile, Denmark sensed an opening to reverse earlier losses and threatened from the west. The Swedish king confronted the classic problem of a mid-sized great power, multiple enemies, finite resources, and a victory that created as many fronts as it solved. His answer was the boldest stroke of his reign. turn on Denmark, remove the guardian of the straits, and then dictate terms to all others. In the year remembered as 1657, Sweden declared war on Denmark-Norway. Swedish columns surged into Jutland while the fleet probed the Danish navy. Winter came hard, and with it the audacity that defines Charles's legend. The Baltic froze. Rather than wait for spring, the king led his army across the ice of the belts, moving from the mainland to Funen and then towards Zealand. The march combined reconnaissance with daring. Cavalry tested ice thickness, engineers marked safe lanes. Infantry followed in organized files. Danish defenses, expecting water to guard them, found ice delivering their enemy to the gates. The result was the Treaty of Roskilde in early spring of the year, remembered as 1658, among the most dramatic diplomatic outcomes in Scandinavian history. Denmark ceded Scania, Blekinge, and Halland on the southern Scandinavian peninsula, as well as Bohuslän on the west coast. Other gains included Trøndelag in Norway and the island of Bornholm, though these outer prizes would prove temporary. The essential change was strategic. Sweden now held the fertile, populous provinces directly across the Sound from Zealand. The Baltic, already a Swedish sphere, seemed at last on the verge of becoming a Swedish lake. Charles could not resist pressing further. Later that same year, he attempted to finish Denmark outright by besieging Copenhagen, hoping to force a union on Swedish terms. Here, the hazards of audacity emerged. The Dutch Republic, fearing Swedish control of the straits and the throttling of northern trade, sent a fleet. In the Battle of the Sound, Dutch ships broke the Swedish blockade and relieved the city. The siege dragged on, resources bled away, and winter's ally, the ice, did not return as a second miracle. Maritime commerce, not just armies, had a voice in who ruled the north. Meanwhile, alliances shifted under the pressure of events. Brandenburg, enticed by better terms, switched sides with the treaties of Wehlau and Bromberg, receiving full sovereignty in Ducal Prussia. What had been a Swedish vassal relationship turned into an independent power on Sweden's southern flank. In Poland, the Commonwealth recovered its balance, and with Transylvanian and later Habsburg support, it pushed back. Swedish taxpayers at home and burghers in Baltic cities felt the cost of a war now spread from Copenhagen's walls to the forests of Samogitia. The crown's fiscal military engine groaned but kept turning. Administratively, Charles tightened the screws. He convened the estates and launched a broad reduction of noble lands granted in earlier decades, reclaiming estates for the crown to pay soldiers and garrison the new southern provinces. This was not yet the sweeping reduction of his son's later reign, but it established a precedent and signaled priorities. The state would feed the army first and placate magnates second. Officials catalogued manors, audited revenues, and diverted rents to the treasury. Such measures bred resistance, but kept regiments in the field and ships at sea. The southern Scandinavian provinces began the process of integration. Swedish law, weights, and measures were introduced. Bishoprics were folded into the national church, and garrisons stood watch in towns that had long looked to Copenhagen. The crown promised burghers stability, roads, and trade. It demanded taxes and loyalty. Over time, elites who had learned Danish statutes learned to read Swedish ordinances. The work was delicate and would take a generation, but the direction was set. Scania and its neighbors were no longer borderlands. They were pillars of a reconfigured realm. The war, however, refused to end on Swedish terms. Copenhagen held, and Bornholm and Trøndelag erupted in rebellion. Dutch and English interests kept fleets in the Sound, unwilling to see one power seal a waterway all merchants needed. In Poland, Swedish garrisons adapted to a war of posts, holding towns while field forces maneuvered to protect supply. The army's famed mobility remained, but attrition gnawed. Recruits from the provinces replaced veterans, arrears accumulated despite Oxenstierna's structures, and commanders faced the relentless arithmetic of too many sieges and not enough coin. Charles the Tenth. Gustav never ceased moving. Even as negotiations opened, he schemed for one more decisive blow. Talking of renewed drives against Denmark, and sudden offensives against remaining enemies. Fate closed the door. He fell ill and died in the early months remembered as 1660, leaving a minor heir and a council to salvage gains and settle terms. The peace that followed had a different voice, less triumph, more consolidation. But much of what had been taken at sword's point could be kept by treaty if Sweden accepted limits to its reach. The Peace of Oliva confirmed an end to the long Polish War. Sweden renounced claims to the Polish crown and kept Livonian lands already secure under Swedish rule. The pact also acknowledged Brandenburg's sovereignty in Prussia, a concession that reduced Sweden's leverage in the south but reflected realities on the ground. The Treaty of Copenhagen followed, restoring Bornholm to Denmark and Trøndelag to Norway, while confirming the great cessions of Scania, Blekinge, Halland, and Bohuslän to Sweden. The map fixed what the ice and the sword had made possible, then trimmed what commerce and coalition had made impossible. What did these years change? First, they moved Sweden's heart toward the south. Scania's fields, towns, and ports became integral to the kingdom's economy and defense. Control of both sides of the Sound's approaches reduced Denmark's ability to throttle Swedish trade and anchored Stockholm's claim to Baltic primacy. Second, they exposed the cost of being everywhere at once. War on three fronts can be started with daring, but it must be paid with coin, ships, and men for as many winters as it lasts. Charles's genius won astonishing advantages. His impatience created liabilities his successors had to manage. There were human consequences in every province touched by these campaigns. In Poland, the deluge left ruined farms and bitter memories. In Denmark and Norway, surrendered provinces felt the wrench of new rulers and new laws. In Sweden proper, taxpayers carried extraordinary burdens, and families watched sons march to strange place names that soon filled the kingdom's chronicles. Yet the state's capacity grew under pressure. Accounts improved, roads were mapped, and officers learned to pivot from siegecraft to diplomacy in a single season. Hard experience became institutional knowledge. Charles the Eleventh inherited a map wider than any Swedish king had ever known, but he did not yet inherit the power to rule it. A regency, anchored by the Queen Dowager Hedvig Eleonora and led in practice by magnates such as Magnus Gabriel de la Gardie, managed policy while the young king grew. Their task was not glorious conquest, but careful maintenance, to feed garrisons from the Weser to the Gulf of Finland, to keep customs flowing through scattered ports, and to keep neighbors wary rather than enraged. Success would mean that the audacity of the previous reign could harden into a durable order. Failure would mean that the water would rush out as quickly as it had rushed in. The regency began with triage. Armies still stood in Bremen-Verden and in western Pomerania. Fleets needed stores, and creditors knocked. The council tightened collection of customs in German river towns and along the Swedish coast, pressed provincial officials for punctual tax remittances, and renegotiated arrears owed to officers. Where possible, garrisons were trimmed to skeleton strength during winters, and commanders were instructed to buy locally only with stamped warrants to prevent predatory billeting. Every trooper kept paid, and every ship kept afloat was a political act. It told allies and rivals that Sweden remained a system, not just a memory of victories. Holding scattered territories required more than coin. It required rules that could travel. The regency instructed governors to standardize procedure without tearing the fabric of local life. In Pomerania and in the North Sea bishoprics, Swedish law sat beside established town rights. Appeals could run to Swedish commissioners, but magistrates kept familiar routines in markets and guilds. This careful duality kept commerce moving while binding elites to the new order. In the southern Scandinavian provinces, the work cut closer to the bone. Scania and Blekinge received Swedish courts, Swedish parish oversight, and Swedish administrative language. Yet the crown promised to respect property and local customs that did not contradict royal statutes. Institutions followed ideas. To anchor the southern provinces, the regency founded a university at Lund in the middle of the 1660s. training clergy and officials who would speak the idiom of Stockholm while serving communities long ruled from Copenhagen. Roads were surveyed, post stations set, and customs offices reorganized so that revenue flowed north with fewer stoppages. Fortifications at Malmöhus, Kristianstad, and the Key Narrows were inspected and strengthened, making the new frontier a belt rather than a line. Integration did not mean instant uniformity. It meant predictable administration in Swedish hands. Abroad, the council learned to harvest peace as a crop. French subsidies, promised by the court of Louis XIV to keep Sweden friendly, or at least neutral, became a pillar of the budget in these years. Paris paid because a strong Sweden checked Denmark, distracted Brandenburg, and complicated Habsburg planning. Stockholm accepted because subsidies allowed garrisons to eat without wringing every last coin from overtaxed parishes. This bargain disciplined policy. When French interests pointed one way and Swedish prudence pointed another, the Regency moved cautiously, cashing promises without spending the army. Even with subsidies, friction could not be avoided. The city of Bremen resisted Swedish overlordship, and a short campaign in the later 1660s, remembered as the second round in a long quarrel, ended with a treaty that confirmed Swedish sovereignty over the surrounding lands while acknowledging city privileges. The lesson was typical of the period. Sweden preferred to turn hostile dependencies into compliant partners rather than to smash them and inherit rubble. A sullen but functioning port was better than a scorched one that paid nothing. The most persistent diplomatic thorn was Brandenburg-Prussia under the Great Elector, Frederick William. He had traded homage for sovereignty during the previous reign, and now built a compact, efficient state that encroached upon Swedish interests along the Oder and in Pomerania. Paper struggles over frontier lines became real struggles over dues and garrison rights. Swedish governors complained that Brandenburg officials cut off river tolls and lured trade away from Swedish harbors. Brandenburg counters accused Swedes of high-handed searches and seizures. The Regency sought to freeze these quarrels in arbitration while reinforcing the very positions under dispute. The navy remained the empire's invisible spine. Without regular convoys and quick sailings, Bremen-Verden would feel very far away and Pomerania would feel exposed. The Admiralty reorganized victualling, insisted on standardized calibers for ship guns to simplify supply, and kept hulls fit for the shallow approaches of Baltic ports. Captains drilled to escort merchantmen rather than chase glory. When storms or ice delayed sailings, governors in German territories were ordered to conserve powder and provisions, a reminder that maritime distances created administrative winters even when the calendar said summer. At home, the Regency's rule turned on a delicate contract with the Swedish nobility. Magnates had won vast estates and incomes during the long wars and expected a leading voice in policy. In return, they were to keep order in the countryside, furnish officers for regiments, and accept the routines of the central colleges. The balance mostly held, but the bill for empire never stopped growing. Voices in the Riksdag began to call for a systematic reduction of noble lands to refill the treasury and restore the crown's independence. The council bided its time, knowing that a child king could not impose what only a grown monarch could carry through. While accounts ruled much of daily policy, the Regency did not neglect the long view. It supported improvements in mining and iron production, understanding that weapons, anchors, and export coin all flowed from Swedish ore. Contracts with Dutch and English buyers were renewed on terms that promised steady volumes rather than flashy prices, promoting predictability over windfalls. Customs officials learned to read manifests from Riga and Wismar as well as from Stockholm and Gothenburg, mapping a trading realm as carefully as generals mapped marches and sieges. Religious policy continued the steady Lutheran order laid down in earlier decades, now extended across new provinces. Bishops were installed in southern dioceses, willing to preach in both Swedish and Danish tongues during the transition, and parish schools received primers that used the Stockholm Bible. The aim was not to erase identities overnight, but to reduce the friction between local practice and central rule. Clergy became couriers of law as much as shepherds of souls, keeping registers that doubled as tax lists and conscription rolls. Even in a period of relative quiet, the Baltic remained a place of sudden alarms. Raids by privateers, disputes over flags and salutes, and skirmishes over fishing rights flared and faded along the coasts. Each incident had the potential to widen. The council sent measured complaints through envoys and quietly shifted ships before it shifted tone. The rule was simple: avoid a general war unless the map could be improved by it. The memory of how quickly coalitions could form, Dutch merchants, Danish admirals, and Brandenburg horse, kept ambitions tethered to caution. The Regency also faced the human reality of garrison rule. Soldiers stationed in German towns married, opened small businesses, and put down roots. Their presence could stabilize or irritate. Commanders issued orders to buy bread at fair prices, to use billets respectfully, and to march cleanly through harvest fields. They did not always succeed. Petitions from city councils reached Stockholm complaining of misconduct. Fines followed. Officers were rotated. The council understood that legitimacy in distant enclaves depended on rumor as much as on law, and rumor traveled on every wagon. As the young king approached his majority, the political weather shifted. Merchants wanted lower tolls and fewer musters. Peasants wanted relief from extraordinary taxes that had never quite become ordinary. Lesser nobles resented the grandeur of a few great houses. The Regency's leading magnates, confident in their networks and reputations, underestimated the appetite for change if the king chose to seize it. Advisors who had kept the ship steady in heavy seas now looked like men who preferred comfortable anchorage to purposeful sailing. Abroad, storms were gathering that would test the caution of these years. France's push against the Dutch Republic threatened to redraw alliances. If Sweden stood too close to Paris, it risked isolating itself from maritime powers whose fleets could decide the Sound. If it stood too far, it risked losing the subsidies that had balanced the books. Brandenburg grew stronger under constant drill and reform. Denmark watched the southern provinces for any sign of weakness. And the Commonwealth, though scarred, had not forgotten Swedish campaigns across its fields and churches. Empire at high tide meant enemies with sharpened memories. The hinge came when alliance diplomacy pulled Stockholm toward actions that looked from Berlin and Copenhagen like opportunity. Swedish arms moved against Brandenburg in support of French strategy during the Dutch conflict, expecting a swift campaign and a modest settlement. Instead, the march provoked Danish fear and German resistance. Bridges that had carried customs and correspondence now carried troops from the other side. The era of maintenance was ending, and the empire would have to fight to justify its breadth. On the eve of these new wars, Sweden still possessed important advantages. Its administrative colleges could mobilize faster than most neighbors. Its navy could move men and money along interior seas, and its officer corps retained the habit of disciplined, written command. It also possessed a monarch coming into his own, with a memory of childhood overshadowed by counselors and a clear sense of how dependency on magnate estates had tied policy to private interests. The tools for reform lay ready. The need for reform was about to become undeniable. Charles the Eleventh reached his majority just as the calm years of regency gave way to alarms. A chain of alliances in Western Europe dragged Sweden into conflict with Brandenburg, and Denmark seized the moment to try to recover the rich southern provinces lost in earlier treaties. What followed is remembered as the Scanian War, a brutal test fought on fields from Fehrbellin to Lund, and on cold seas where ships splintered under iron and wind. Out of its hardships, Charles the Eleventh forged an absolutist monarchy and rebuilt the state's finances with a sweeping seizure of noble lands known as the Reduction. The war opened badly. Marching in step with French strategy against the Dutch, Swedish forces moved against the Great Elector, Frederick William of Brandenburg, and were checked at Fehrbellin. The defeat was more moral than material, yet it emboldened enemies. Denmark's Christian V landed in Scania with a seasoned army. Local guerrillas known as Snappenar harried Swedish supply lines, and Danish squadrons, steered by admirals like Niels Juel and Cornelis Tromp, prowled the Sound. The young king learned quickly that empire at high tide could ebb fast when the sea belonged to someone else. The struggle shifted to open water. Off Öland, the Swedish flagship Kronan capsized and exploded during a confused maneuver, taking with it experienced officers and any hope of immediate naval dominance. Danish control of the straits followed, confirmed by victory at Koga Bay, where Niels Juel used tide and shoal to trap and batter Swedish ships. Command of the sea meant that Copenhagen could reinforce Scania and threaten Sweden's coasts at will. For the Crown in Stockholm, the lesson cut deep. Without a reliable fleet, no customs house or fortress could be considered secure. On land, the decision would be written in winter blood. Near Lund, in Scania's flat fields and hedgerows, the opposing armies met. Charles the Eleventh personally rode with the Swedish line in a bitter, close fight where frost stung and daylight faded too soon. The battle swung wildly, yet the king's insistence on attack and regroup, learned from drill yards and hard marches, paid off. The Danish army broke, leaving the field to Sweden. Lund did not end the war, but it ended the sense that Denmark's return to the southern provinces was inevitable. Denmark struck again the next summer, and again the Swedish army stood its ground at Landskrona. The king's presence stiffened resolve, and commanders who had tasted defeat earlier in the war now executed with steadier hands. Even so, Denmark's hold of the sea prevented a clean decision. The conflict became a contest of sieges, raids, and stubborn garrisons. In German territories, Brandenburg pressed hard into western Pomerania and Bremen-Verden, forcing Sweden to spread its resources thin. The Crown relied on France to pry enemies away at the peace table, even as it fought to keep them away on the field. Diplomacy finally untied the knots that arms could not cut. With French pressure heavy on the empire and the Dutch war moving toward settlement, Brandenburg and Denmark accepted negotiations. Treaties signed at Lund and Saint-Germain-en-Laye restored most positions in the empire to their pre-war status. And, crucially, Sweden retained Scania, Blekinge, Halland, and Bohuslän. Some border strips shifted and indemnities were paid, but the essential fact stood: the southern provinces remained Swedish. It had taken winter battles, French leverage, and stubborn garrisons to hold what a generation earlier had been taken in a lightning march across ice. The war left a second battlefield at home, the treasury. Years of campaigning across scattered coasts had strained credit and swollen arrears. Magnates who dominated the regency owned vast estates granted during earlier wars. Their incomes rivaled crown revenues, and their influence had too often bent policy. Charles the Eleventh concluded that survival required a different balance. At the Riksdag of the estates, he pressed for measures that would turn extraordinary wartime seizures into a permanent reordering of power. The estates consented, and the king moved. The reduction began as a legal program and became a revolution in revenue. Commissions reviewed grants made to nobles since earlier reigns, measured obligations actually fulfilled, and reclaimed lands deemed excessive or improperly alienated. The process was relentless and often unpopular among the great houses, yet it followed statutes and audits, not the king's whim. Manors, mills, and tolls flowed back to the crown. Rents that had fed private households now stocked the war chest. Officers found their salaries paid more regularly. Garrisons received bread before proclamations, and the crown, at last, could finance policy without begging. Absolutism grew from these fiscal roots. With revenue secure and diets accustomed to assent, Charles the Eleventh asserted that the monarchy was not merely first among estates, but the sovereign engine of the realm. Councils continued to advise, yet decisions now moved with a single will. The king toured provinces, inspected fortresses, and surprised officials with pointed questions about ledgers and stocks. Peasants might not love taxes, but they knew that arrears would buy soldiers bread rather than courtiers diamonds. Authority, steady and somewhat austere, took on a Swedish face that blended practicality with discipline. The army's structure followed the money. Charles advanced the allotment system, pairing regiments with districts responsible for equipping and sustaining soldiers. Farmsteads clustered into Rotar maintained a soldier and his small holding, creating a predictable flow of recruits and supplies without crushing any single community. In return, the army promised better training, stricter justice, and care for widows and orphans when men fell. The result was a force that could mobilize quickly, march far, and keep its cohesion under pressure. It was not glamorous, but it was dependable, and dependability wins wars. Sea power received a new anchor. Recognizing that Stockholm's waters iced and that control of the southern narrows demanded proximity, the Crown founded a great naval base at Karlskrona in Blekinge. There, deep and sheltered approaches allowed ships to winter and sail earlier in spring. Docks, rope walks, foundries, and storehouses grew into a city planned for fleets. Officers trained crews to fight in shallows and currents peculiar to the southern Baltic. Gunners standardized shot, and the Admiralty drilled a peacetime routine that would translate into wartime tempo. After Öland and Koga Bay, the message was plain: never again be unready at sea. Law and church kept pace with iron and oak. A new church law codified parish life, set standards for catechism, and required clergy to keep registers of births, marriages, and deaths. Literacy rose as families absorbed the habit of reading scripture and primers, and parish schools trained children to sign their names and count. These humble skills fed the state as surely as they fed the soul. Soldiers who could read orders made fewer mistakes. Clerks drawn from humble backgrounds filled offices once reserved for a few great families. Administration became broader and deeper. The southern provinces remained a special focus. Integration of Scania and its neighbors demanded patience after the wounds of war. The Crown offered privileges to towns that cooperated, invested in roads that tied fields to ports, and staffed courts with officials willing to hear cases in both tongues while insisting on Swedish statutes. Guerrilla bands were hunted down with severity, but once order returned, the policy shifted to one of normalcy and predictable rule. Over a generation, the memory of Danish law gave way to the daily reality of Swedish administration, and loyalty followed stability. None of this insulated the realm from nature's blows. Harvest failures in the mid and late 1690s brought hunger across broad regions. The king's system of stores and transport lessened suffering in some districts, but it could not erase it. Parish registers filled with grim entries, the army delayed muster in the hardest-hit areas, and the treasury diverted coin from ship timber to grain. Here, the strength of the new order showed in a different way. Records allowed officials to target relief, authority allowed them to override local hesitations, and the habit of obedience allowed the plan to work as far as weather would permit. The international situation also required quiet firmness. Brandenburg still pressed its interests along the Oder. Denmark watched Karlskrona grow with narrowed eyes, and the Commonwealth, though battered, remained a factor near Livonia. France's long wars shifted the pattern of subsidies, making self-reliance more important. Charles the Eleventh did not chase distant glory. He drilled, built, audited, and bargained. When friction flared over river tolls or garrison rights, the Crown answered with a legal brief backed by a mobilization schedule. Neighbors might dislike a confident Sweden, but they had to respect a solvent one. Charles the Twelfth came to the throne as a teenager, shaped by drill yards, catechism, and the stern legacy of his father's reforms. The machine he inherited was tight and obedient. Regiments tied to provinces, a navy now breathing from Karlskrona, and a treasury steadied by the reduction. Across the Baltic, 3 rulers read that strength as a threat. Frederick IV of Denmark-Norway, Augustus II of Saxony and Poland-Lithuania, and Peter the Great of Russia formed a coalition to cut Sweden down before the young king found his stride. Their plan counted on surprise and on Sweden's supposed inexperience. They misjudged both. The coalition moved almost at once. Danish troops pressed Holstein-Gottorp, Sweden's ally on the Jutland flank, while Saxon forces crossed into Livonia to threaten Riga. Farther east, Russian armies pushed toward Narva and Ingria, seeking the sea window Moscow had long lacked. The map that had once displayed Swedish reach now looked like a ring tightening around Stockholm. Charles answered with speed, not caution. He would dismantle the coalition one partner at a time, beginning with the foe whose blow lay closest to Sweden's throat. That first pivot was Denmark. Charles gathered troops along the west coast, embarked them under the protection of maritime powers alarmed by Danish ambitions, and in a stroke landed on Zealand near Humlebæk. The move was as political as it was military. By appearing on the doorstep of Copenhagen, he split Danish nerve from Danish strength. Within weeks, negotiations at Travendal forced Denmark out of the war, released Holstein-Gottorp from peril, and freed Swedish hands for the eastern fronts. The coalition's ring became a broken chain. From Zealand, the king sailed for the Baltic's colder edge. In Estonia, Russian armies had ringed Narva with lines and guns, confident that a winter siege would do what earlier decades had not. Snow and sleet greeted the Swedish columns as they approached. Charles used the weather, the terrain, and his drilled tempo. A sudden assault through a storm shattered the Russian camp. Formations crumpled, cannon and colors were taken in heaps. Narva did more than rescue a fortress. It humbled the coalition's newest partner and gave Stockholm a breathing space to deal with the more experienced Saxon foe to the south. The choice that followed shaped years. Rather than march at once toward Moscow, Charles turned south into the Commonwealth, judging that a swift decision there would isolate Russia and deny it an ally with deep resources and convenient bridgeheads. He moved with a light step, anchoring supply on river routes and forcing battle where proxy and delay had long ruled. At Klisov, he met a combined Saxon-Polish force and used the Swedish way of war, coordinated volleys, agile artillery, and decisive cavalry charges, to tear holes that his officers widened with relentless pressure. The victory opened the road to Warsaw and then to Krakow. Warfare in Poland-Lithuania was as much a constitutional struggle as a military one. Charles supported a Warsaw Confederation that favored his aims and pushed to unseat Augustus II, whose personal union with Saxony had brought the Commonwealth into the war. The Diet crowned Stanisław Leszczyński, a noble acceptable to Swedish policy and to factions tired of Saxon leverage. Behind the ceremonies lay the same calculus that had moved Swedish policy for decades: secure friendly ports and corridors, then shape the politics that determine who pays for their defense. The Scandinavia-born fiscal military method now worked on the Vistula. The king's strategic horizon widened. He pressed the Saxon electorate itself, crossing into Germany to strike at the root of Augustus's power. Field marches bypassed strongpoints, and threatened cities measured their loyalties against the discipline of Swedish quartering and the certainty of Swedish pay. The campaign culminated in the settlement at Altrandstedt, which forced Augustus to renounce the Polish crown and break with Russia. For a time, the coalition vanished. Sweden stood in Poland with a client king, Saxony bowed, and Russia licked its wounds. It was a breathtaking cascade of outcomes for a monarch still barely past youth. Yet each success carried new strain. Garrisons in Livonia, Prussia, and Poland needed coin and bread. Roads across the Commonwealth were long, and the politics of confederations and diets changed with the wind. Swedish regiments, though cohesive, felt the grind of winter quarters in provinces far from their home farms. The king answered by living as they did, eating coarse rations and riding out in storms to inspect trenches and posts. That example held the army together even when arrears mounted. It also hardened Charles's belief that will could outpace friction, a conviction that would soon be tested. While Sweden threshed Saxon power, Peter the Great rebuilt Russia's military system with ruthless energy. He borrowed foreign engineers, trained gunners, and drilled infantry in new formations. He built shipyards on the lakes, fortified along rivers, and pushed again into Ingria and Karelia. Where Narva had been a humiliation, new sieges brought new results. The Russians took footholds that threatened Sweden's eastern rim, and along the Neva they laid the foundations of a city that announced intent as much as presence. Charles read these signs and resolved to finish the matter with Russia before its reforms ripened fully. The question was route and timing. Many counselors urged a return to the Baltic's edge to cut away the new Russian positions. Charles chose instead a deeper thrust. He would drive into the Russian heartland, force the Tsar to a stand, and translate tactical brilliance into strategic submission. The army assembled in Poland and moved across difficult borderlands into what Swedish officers called the poor country beyond the Dnieper. Supply lines stretched, local resources thinned, and Russian light troops mastered a kind of war that had little glory and endless cost. Still, the Swedish columns retained their edge in battle. When Russian detachments risked stand-up fights, Swedish brigades punished them. When fortresses could be taken by coup de main, the king ordered bold escalades. But the pattern began to favor the defender. Scorched fields and burned granaries forced Swedish procurement parties to ride farther and risk more. Weather cut wagons to half speed. The very strengths that had made Sweden formidable, tight drill, precise schedules, and reliance on magazines, grew brittle when the calendar slipped and the distances tripled. In this phase, a new star rose within the Russian command, a noble named Alexander Menshikov, quick in movement and sharp in reading the shifting edge of battle. He and other lieutenants harassed Swedish columns, tore up roads, and captured stragglers. For every brilliant counterstroke executed by a Swedish captain, a dozen small losses bled away horses, powder, and time. The king drove on, determined to find the decisive meeting he believed the Tsar could not refuse forever. But Peter had learned from the old Swedish masters. He would accept battle only on ground that had been prepared by months of pressure. Meanwhile, the political scaffolding behind Charles began to creak. Stanisław Leszczyński's position in Warsaw remained contingent on Swedish presence. If the main army marched too far east for too long, Polish magnates recalculated, and Saxon influence could seep back. In Sweden proper, the machinery of the allotment system and the Karlskrona yards continued to function, yet every replacement ship and company cost dearer coin. France, distracted by its own fronts, sent fewer subsidies. The early war had been paid by victories. The Middle War required bookkeeping as severe as any campaign. Within the army, discipline held, but murmurs grew. Veterans who had fought at Narva and Klisov now led squads of boys from provinces whose rotar had emptied twice in quick succession. Officers sealed their letters with phrases about honor and necessity while asking the War College for boots and salt. Charles answered, as he always had, by moving forward and sharing the hardships he demanded. He slept in the open, read scripture with chaplains, and drilled companies between marches. The king's example stood in for rest and for warmth. Often it was enough. The human cost reached beyond strategy. Towns along the Vistula and in Lithuania had learned to live under Swedish regulation. Now they learned to live without dependable markets as the war's center drifted east. Ingria and Livonia felt the back and forth of raids and reprisals. Russian peasants fled before armies that ate their barns and trampled their winter rye. When the Tsar's new city rose along the Neva, it sprang from a swamp fed by labor that scarcely had time to weep. War remade landscapes as surely as it remade maps. The Swedish march into the east met a new kind of opponent, distance armed with time. Charles the Twelfth pressed beyond the Commonwealth toward the Russian heartland, convinced that one decisive encounter would shatter the Tsar's reforms before they hardened. Peter the Great refused that script. He burned fodder, emptied granaries, cut bridges, and let the Swedish columns trade speed for hunger. The farther the king advanced, the more his magazines thinned and the more his strategy depended on finding battle on his own terms. A first hard blow fell at Lesnaya. General Lewenhaupt hauled a great convoy of powder, bread, and shot toward the main army, a lifeline meant to restore tempo. Russian forces intercepted in rain and mud, and after savage fighting, the wagons were lost or burned. Men reached Charles, the supplies did not. The campaign staggered from deficit to deficit. Horses without oats, boots without soles, guns without teams. Each council of war circled the same truth. Only a major victory could repair what attrition had already taken. In this strait, Charles reached for politics to solve logistics. he turned toward the Hetmanate, where Ivan Mazepa, long a partner of Moscow, now sought a path to autonomy. The promise seemed real: Ukrainian grain, horse, and winter shelter in exchange for Swedish support for a new alignment. The Tsar read the danger at once and struck. Russian detachments devastated Mazepa's capital at Baturin, killing garrison and townsfolk and destroying stores. By the time the Swedes arrived, the barns were ash and the cellars empty, and Mazepa's support had shrunk to those willing to stake everything on Charles's gamble. Winter closed like a vice. The army scattered into cold billets that were little more than roofs against the wind. Forage parties rode farther each day and returned with less. Frost cracked wheels and men alike, yet discipline held. The Swedish habit of drill and the king's refusal to accept comforts steadied ranks that might otherwise have dissolved. Chaplains kept prayers. Officers measured rations with brutal fairness, and every dawn opened with the same resolution: hold order until a chance for battle appeared. Spring brought motion and a target. Charles chose Poltava, a fortress on the Vorskla that guarded crossings and magazines supporting Russian positions. If the Swedes could seize it, they could force Peter either to fight or to watch his line unravel. Siege works went up, guns dug in, and trenches crept forward. But Russian relief was already moving, and the king, wounded in the foot during a skirmish, directed operations from a litter. The army faced a choice between finish and meat. It chose meeting battle on ground that would later be cursed in Swedish memory. Peter the Great arrayed his forces behind redoubts and earthworks anchored in open fields, a new style for a reformed army that mixed entrenchment with trained maneuver. The Swedish plan demanded speed: punch through the chain of fieldworks before enemy lines cohered, then throw the infantry at the main position while cavalry struck the flanks. Initial assaults cracked several redoubts, but precious time leaked away in confusion, smoke, and the king's limited mobility. Russian artillery, better served than in earlier years, hammered lanes the Swedes had to cross. When the blue-coated brigades reached the main line, they were bloodied and too few. The Swedish right achieved a momentary penetration. The left faltered under weight of fire. Reserves were late where they were needed early. Russian counterattacks, led with determination by commanders who now trusted their troops, pressed the crisis. Charles's generals tried to re-knit the line, but powder ran low and files thinned. The decisive charge never came. Instead, ranks that had carried wars across seas lost momentum in a shallow valley far from home. When the order to withdraw could no longer be denied, the army had been broken in spirit as well as in formation. Defeat at Poltava did not kill the king, but it killed the campaign. The wounded monarch and the remnant of his forces fell back toward the Dnieper, seeking refuge with Ottoman authorities beyond the river's lower reaches. At Perevalokna, thousands under General Lowenhaupt, cut off and starving, laid down arms to a pursuing enemy. Guns, standards, and men were lost in numbers that the Swedish system back home could not soon replace. The dream of forcing the Tsar to sue for peace gave way to the nightmare of safeguarding a retreat across hostile plains. Charles crossed into Ottoman territory and established a restless exile at Bender. He wrote letters, argued causes, and urged the Porte to seize a moment of advantage. The Ottoman court listened with interest and caution. The Tsar's armies were deep in fatigue, and the Sultan had reasons of his own to test them. Yet the Swede who urged war was a guest without an army, a king whose victories lay behind him. Diplomacy could not conjure battalions. Stockholm would have to hold the realm while its monarch schemed from a foreign threshold. Peter the Great moved with startling speed to harvest the fruits of Poltava. Riga fell after a long siege. Reval accepted new masters. Vyborg, gateway to Finland, was taken. Garrison by garrison, the eastern and southern Baltic slipped from Sweden's grasp. Russian governors installed new rules with a mixture of severity and bureaucratic ambition. Customs shifted to the Neva, where a new city grew from marsh and decree into a symbol of permanence. The empire that Sweden had built along coasts and rivers was being pried apart by a power that had learned, at last, to live at sea as well as on land. The shockwaves rolled across societies. Merchants who had balanced ledgers in Swedish riksdaler recalculated in new coin and before new courts. Livonian nobles weighed oaths against survival. Lutheran pastors saw congregations recoded into a different administrative world. In Sweden proper, the War College read casualty lists and garrison reports with mounting disbelief. Then began the grim work of raising regiments anew. The allotment system bent to its burden, calling men from farms that had already sent fathers and sons in earlier campaigns. On the diplomatic front, Sweden searched for anchors where victory had once supplied them. Queen Dowager and council sought loans abroad. Allies measured engagements against their own wars and interests. Denmark and Saxony tasted opportunity again, and Brandenburg looked to old disputes in Pomerania with revived appetite. The web of enemies that the king had cut at the war's opening rewove itself in the wake of a single field lost. The strategic vision of isolating Russia had inverted. Now Sweden risked isolation while the Tsar bargained from strength. In the south, the Ottoman court did indeed test the Russian position. Along the Pruth, the Tsar's forces found themselves encircled and at risk, a rare moment when fortune reversed. Negotiations saved them. Azov was surrendered. Promises were made. Charles, watching from exile, seethed at what he saw as timidity and urged a renewed offensive that never came. The window closed. The Sultan had demonstrated leverage without embracing a long war for a northern guest's cause. The Swedish king remained at Bender, a figure of fascination and frustration, a warrior without a battlefield. Within Sweden, practical minds worked to avert collapse. The navy, battered but not broken, escorted what commerce remained and guarded the western approaches. Karlskrona's yards patched hulls and cast guns while rationing oak and rope. Fortresses around Stockholm and along the Gotha River were provisioned with a seriousness that admitted new realities. Parish registers ticked on, counting births, deaths, and recruits, because the state still believed that order on paper could generate order in the field. In hard times, the habit of record became a quiet form of courage. The human fabric frayed but did not tear. In Finland, border communities watched new flags rise across nearby rivers and learned to live under watch and rumor. In central Sweden, women managed farms tied to the allotment system, kept accounts for absent husbands, and petitioned for arrears due to the fallen. Chaplains wrote homilies that threaded obedience and endurance into hope without illusion. Veterans with empty sleeves taught boys to drill with sticks and told them that a line can be remade if a will can be remade. The nation's memory began to absorb Poltava not as an end, but as an instruction. Poltava broke the arc of Swedish expansion, but it did not end the war. From exile on the edge of the Ottoman world, Charles the Twelfth urged a new front against the Tsar while Stockholm tried to hold what remained. The coalition against Sweden regrew, now steadied by Russia's confident advance. Denmark watched the southern provinces for signs of weakness. Saxony and the Commonwealth weighed old claims. Prussia and Hanover saw chances along the German coast. The struggle shifted from bold thrusts to a grinding contest over ports, islands, and survival. Russia moved first to secure the eastern Baltic. With Swedish field armies shattered, Peter the Great drove sieges along the coast, replacing Swedish garrisons with his own and turning captured harbors into stepping stones for a navy in the making. The victory at sea that Russia needed came in the Gulf of Finland at a place Swedes called Hangö. There, Russian galleys swarmed Swedish ships trapped by wind and shoal. It was a sharp lesson. In narrow waters filled with islands, oars and numbers could beat sail and tradition. From that point, Russian squadrons raided with growing confidence. Along the Neva, the Tsar's new city hardened from plan to fact. It became a customs funnel that reoriented trade away from Riga and Reval toward the new imperial court. Russian officials imposed order with a blend of severity and bookkeeping learned from Western tutors. Lutheran churches kept their rights, but Swedish ordinances vanished from town halls as Russian chancelleries stamped their seals on contracts and toll receipts. The Swedish empire of coasts and customs that had seemed so secure after Westphalia was being dismantled, ledger by ledger and key by key. Charles the Twelfth refused to let the story end there. After long bargaining and a dramatic quarrel with his hosts, he left Ottoman lands and rode back to Sweden through Europe at punishing speed. He reached home to find a realm disciplined but strained, a navy that could fight but not everywhere at once, and allies who measured promises against recent defeats. He made a stark choice. Rather than chase Russia deep into territories now fortified and supplied, he would strike Denmark and Norway to force one enemy out and to protect the southern provinces by threatening Copenhagen's flank. The Norwegian campaigns were hard marches through mountains and weather that spared no rank. The first push took key positions, and hopes rose that pressure on Norway might roll Danish policy back. Then came a siege at Fredrikstad that turned into a symbol. As Swedish batteries clawed at the walls, a shot struck the king. He fell at night, and with him fell the will that had driven the army through years of hardship. Officers held the lines for a time, but the campaign unraveled. The withdrawal from Norway closed an effort that had sought strategic relief and delivered only sorrow. The king's death reopened Sweden's constitution. The crown passed to his sister, Ulrika Eleonora, who accepted the throne on conditions that restored the estate's powers and curtailed royal will. Soon after, she ceded the crown to her husband, Frederick of Hesse, who became Frederick I under a settlement that strengthened parliamentary governance. This shift did not end the war, but it changed how Sweden would decide the war's end. Decisions now grew from committees and envoys rather than from a single commander's resolve. While politics settled at home, the enemy pressed along the German coast. Stralsund, the great bastion in Swedish Pomerania, faced a coalition of Danes, Prussians, and Saxon troops backed by the sea power of Hanover, now tied to the British crown. The fortress fell after a stubborn defense, and with it, Sweden lost a gate through which it had long managed German affairs. Other towns followed. Bremen-Verden slipped away under pressure and purchase, and Swedish commanders in Wismar counted their powder by the fistful as relief failed to arrive. The necklace of German holdings snapped link by link. Russia carried the war to Sweden's own shores. Galley fleets and landing parties scoured the archipelagos of Finland and the approaches to Stockholm, burning farms and boatyards, a season of terror remembered in Swedish chronicles as the cruel years of coastal raids. The Navy responded where it could, but oar-propelled craft slid into creeks where deep-drafted ships could not follow. Inland, Finnish communities bent under occupation and evacuation, parish books filled with abrupt endings and sudden flights as families chose the forest over the torch. Amid these reverses, Sweden still found ways to resist. The allotment system produced fresh battalions, the War College kept fewer, harder promises, and the Admiralty fought cagey actions to protect convoys that meant bread for towns and pay for garrisons. In the west, Gothenburg held, projecting Swedish strength into the North Sea and anchoring trade that kept the realm alive. In the south, Karlskrona remained the pivot for such sea power as Sweden could still use, a reminder that even in defeat, institutions built in earlier reigns kept the state from collapse. Diplomacy moved in tandem with arms. Sweden opened channels not only to old adversaries but to powers that could guarantee a settlement. Negotiations on the Åland Islands offered a momentary hint of a broader peace with Russia, but mutual suspicion and shifting fronts closed that window. Separate treaties with Prussia, Hanover, and Denmark resolved the German and Danish questions in piecemeal fashion, allowing Stockholm to focus at last on the giant who had profited most from the long war. Each signature traded pride for relief, garrisons for time. By the late teen years of the new century, almost every Swedish calculation pointed toward a final reckoning with the Tsar. The eastern Baltic was gone in all but formalities. Finland groaned. Merchants complained that routes once safe under Swedish convoy now answered to new flags. The council weighed whether another campaign could reverse the tide. The answer, increasingly, was no. The army could fight, the navy could sting, But the treasury could not sustain a war of recovery against a foe whose population and industry had outgrown Sweden's by wide margins. Peace came in the form of the Treaty of Nystad. Sweden ceded Ingria, Estonia, Livonia, and parts of Karelia to Russia, while receiving money and the return of prisoners. In the north, certain territories in Finland were restored, but the great arc of the eastern coast was gone. The treaty recognized what battles had already decided. Russia now stood as the Baltic's dominant power, and Sweden, though still substantial, had left the first rank of European great powers. The paper did not humiliate. It concluded. The realm that remained could be governed, defended, and repaired. The consequences were immediate and long-term. Strategically, Sweden retrenched to the Scandinavian heartland and to a few German positions that could still be held. Economically, trade shifted through Gothenburg and the western routes, while Stockholm recalibrated its customs. Administratively, the estates deepened their role, scrutinizing budgets and favoring policies that promised stability over adventure. The officer corps learned to love drill for its own sake, rather than as prelude to continental campaigns. A new political culture began to emerge, cautious, talkative, and clever with accounts. Human lives marked the ledger in ink and grief. Veterans returned to farms that had supported them through the allotment system, and now needed their strength more than their swords. Widows petitioned for arrears. Children learned to read from primers that carried fewer patriotic hymns to conquest. In coastal parishes, bells recast from captured cannon now tolled for the dead of raids rather than the dead of victory. The memory of Charles the Twelfth shifted from a promise to a warning, honored for courage, yet measured by cost. Peace at Nystad ended Sweden's imperial reach, and the realm faced a question larger than any battlefield: how to govern a mid-sized kingdom without the habits of heroic monarchy. The answer emerged in a constitutional settlement that shifted power from the crown to the Riksdag of the estates and the Council of the Realm. Ulrika Eleonora accepted limits to royal authority, then yielded the throne to Frederick I on terms that bound the monarch to rule with counsel. Sweden entered what contemporaries called the Age of Liberty, a title both hopeful and contested. The new order placed decision-making in committees and chambers. The Riksdag, nobles, clergy, burghers, and peasants, met in regular sessions and steered policy through secret committees that drafted budgets and treaties. Day-to-day administration fell to powerful councillors who owed their chairs less to birth than to party strength. This did not make Sweden a modern democracy, but it did make policy depend on persuasion, bargains, and printed briefs. The state that had once moved at a king's command now moved at the pace of debate. Factions crystallized into parties known as hats and caps. The hats prized honor, commerce, and an assertive foreign line. They believed national pride and prosperity rose together. The caps preached thrift, neutrality, and the repair of finances before risk. Both claimed the mantle of liberty. In practice, the hats leaned toward French alliances and mercantile projects, while the caps trimmed sails when winds turned foul. Parliamentary government became a theater where policy was tested not only by ideas but by who could count votes across estates. Economy set the rhythm of the era. Sweden remained rich in iron and timber, and entrepreneurs pushed to turn raw materials into higher-value goods. The Swedish East India Company, chartered in 1731, sent ships from Gothenburg around the Cape to Canton. They returned with tea, silk, and porcelain, which were sold at auction to European buyers. Profits fed shipyards and financed manufactories, while new tastes filtered into Swedish parlors. The Baltic had once been a highway for empire. Now the world's oceans became a marketplace for recovery. The hats married this commercial ambition to foreign policy and to war. Seduced by French subsidies and a desire to erase the memory of recent defeats, they pressed for a strike on Russia. The war that followed in the early 1740s, often called the Hats' War, went poorly. Hopes of a quick seizure of lost towns dissolved in supply troubles and hesitant leadership. Russia held firm, and a harsh peace cost Sweden more in Finland. The lesson bit deep. Rhetoric about honor could not refill magazines or teach generals in a winter. Alarmed by failure, the realm looked inward. A fortress rose on islands outside Helsingfors, planned and built under Augustin Ehrensvärd from 1748 onward. Later called Sveaborg and now also known as Suomenlinna, it was conceived as a sea-facing bastion to shield Finland and anchor a navy in the east. Docks, ravelins, and casemates turned granite skerries into a stone ship. The project absorbed coin and labor for decades, but it changed strategy. If Sweden could not dominate the Baltic, it could at least deny an enemy an easy path to the heartland. Science and learning flourished under this gentler politics. Carl Linnaeus classified the natural world from Uppsala, turning field walks into a universal language of names. Anders Celsius standardized measurement and observed the skies with a meticulous eye. These figures did not command armies or write treaties, yet they strengthened a culture of precision that matched the administrative habits born in earlier wars. Catalogs, tables, and instruments became national pride in place of captured banners. Money remained the tightrope. The Hats financed manufactures and war by expanding paper credit and by protecting new industries with tariffs. Wages and prices rose, and with them the fear that the currency might outrun trust. The Caps, when they gained power in the mid-1760s, tried a sharp deflation. They tightened the money supply, cut spending, and attacked corruption. The cure hurt. Merchants groaned, workers lost hours, and the countryside felt little relief. Yet the experiment taught Parliament that budgets were as potent as bayonets. Politics in this age could be theatrical. Queen Louisa Ulrika, sister to Frederick the Great of Prussia, gathered a circle of wits and officers who despised party squabbles and dreamt of restoring royal vigor. Their attempted coup in the mid-1750s failed, and punishments followed, but the episode warned the parties that overreach had consequences. The monarchy endured as symbol and balance wheel, while the Riksdag returned to its routines. Sweden's constitution proved elastic enough to absorb drama without collapsing. The 7 Years' War reached Sweden as a limited involvement against Prussia. The Hats pushed the realm into a theater along the Oder and in Pomerania, hoping for gains under a French umbrella. Campaigns lurched forward and back with little decisive result. Soldiers learned again the cost of winter quarters and muddy roads. Taxpayers learned again that glory written in dispatches could vanish in treaties. When peace came, Sweden held little beyond what it had started with, and voters in town halls remembered who had promised more than they delivered. If war disappointed, the press invited hope. In 1766, the Riksdag adopted a groundbreaking Freedom of the Press Act, granting Swedes the right to publish parliamentary proceedings and most official documents, with carefully described limits. Anders Kydenius, a cleric from the north, argued fiercely that open information and free trade would cure corruption and poverty better than any decree. Printers and pamphleteers ran with the new law, and a public sphere widened beyond court and council. Liberty gained substance in paper and ink. Social change accompanied these statutes. Parish schools spread literacy beyond the towns. Catechism lessons taught reading as habit, not luxury. Peasant representatives in the Riksdag grew more confident, sometimes blocking noble plans that would shift burdens down the social ladder. Urban guilds negotiated privileges, while new manufactories hired rural hands in slack seasons, knitting countryside and town into a single labor market. The Age of Liberty did not erase hierarchy, but it opened channels where talent and argument could climb. Yet party rule had shadows. Foreign powers learned to subsidize factions, and ambassadors counted votes like ward bosses. Offices and pensions became currency in a system that prized committee chairs as much as campaigns. Critics complained that the Hats and Caps quarrels served Paris, London, and St. Petersburg more than Stockholm. The charge stung because it had truth. Independence won in constitution could be lost in dependency on allies' coin. The very openness of debate became a field for outside influence. Amid these tensions, Local resilience deepened. Ironmasters in Bergslagen invested in better furnaces and hired Walloon experts to refine techniques. Sawmills along northern rivers fed Britain's shipyards. Tar and pitch found steady buyers. Gothenburg thrived as a western gate, balancing Stockholm's primacy with a second pole of maritime trade. In the archipelago outside Åbo, Sveaborg's walls thickened and dockyards hammered through winter. Incremental gains in craft and infrastructure accumulated into a quieter form of power. By the later 1760s, frustration with party excess met worry about security. Russia's influence in Polish affairs and Danish restlessness along the southern frontier stirred old fears. Many Swedes respected parliamentary liberty, yet doubted that divided leadership could answer a crisis. Into this uncertainty stepped a prince raised on drill, ceremony, and the theater. Gustav, son of the experienced but restrained Adolf Frederick, watched the parties stumble and measured their weakness with a dramatist's eye. Gustav III entered politics as a showman with a statesman's instinct for timing. He watched the Age of Liberty's parties quarrel and concluded that parliamentary freedom without executive energy left Sweden exposed. In late summer of 1772, he staged a swift, almost bloodless coup, disarming the guard of committee government and unveiling a new constitution that restored real authority to the crown while preserving the estates. The move promised order without tyranny, a middle path between the swagger of earlier warrior kings and the drift of party rule. Having seized the helm, Gustav moved to strengthen the ship. He trimmed corruption, simplified tariffs, and promoted freer grain trade to keep bread cheaper in lean seasons. The theater-loving monarch used ceremony and festivals to reknit urban morale, but behind the scenes he pushed legal reform. The Freedom of the Press Act was narrowed to curb political pamphleteering, yet criminal justice saw interventions against torture and an effort to equalize penalties across classes. The message was clear. One law, briskly administered, would replace the old bargaining culture of privilege. Foreign affairs soon intruded. Catherine the Great's Russia bestrode the Baltic world, and Denmark still watched the southern provinces with a predator's patience. Gustav pursued a balancing act, playing Paris, London, and St. Petersburg against one another, until an opportunity and a provocation converged. In 1788, amid frictions over borders and honor at sea, he launched war against Russia, expecting a short campaign that would rally the nation and check imperial pretensions. Instead, he met a frontier of marshes and fortified lines and discovered how hard it was to force a decision without allies on land. The war split the officer corps. In Finland, a group of nobles signed the Angela Declaration, protesting the king's policy and hinting at a separate peace. Gustav denounced the act as treason, removed ringleaders, and doubled down. At sea, the fleet fought Denmark in the Sound and Russia in the archipelagos. On land, garrisons held but breakthroughs proved elusive. The conflict paused with an armistice and then resumed, shifting weight from trenches to oars, where Sweden would find a moment of redemption. That redemption arrived at Svensksund, a battle of oared squadrons fought in the narrow waters off the Finnish coast. Gustav placed himself among the crews and let admirals exploit wind, shoal, and the newly built archipelago fleet. Russian formations crowded into a killing ground of islands and channels where Swedish guns could rake them at close range. The victory was resounding. Shattered galleys drifted or struck, and morale leapt. Though it did not win territory, it gave Gustav leverage to end the war without humiliation and restored pride to a navy that had struggled against deeper drafted foes. War spurred constitutional change at home. In 1789, the king pushed through an act of union and security that further centralized power, weakening noble privilege while pledging to protect peasant and burgher interests. He raised new taxes with fewer committee delays and promoted commoners within the army and administration, arguing that merit should march ahead of pedigree. The old magnate oligarchy, already weakened by earlier reductions, felt cornered by a monarch who claimed both efficiency and popularity. The collision came in a theater of lights and shadows. In 1792, during a masked ball at the Opera House, conspirators struck Gustav with a pistol shot. He died weeks later. The murder ended the reign of a king who had mixed spectacle with reform and who had dared war to restore national confidence. It also reopened the question the coup had tried to settle. How much power should a Swedish monarch hold when the treasury is thin and the neighborhood crowded with larger empires? A regency for the minor Gustav IV Adolf followed, with Duke Karl, later Charles the 13th, as guardian and figures like Gustav Adolf Reuterholm guiding policy. The court trimmed extravagance, yet the wider world moved faster than Stockholm. Across the continent, the French Revolution toppled dynasties and then birthed a new kind of empire under Napoleon. The regency hesitated. The young king, when he took full power, recoiled from revolution so fiercely that prudence became rigidity. His moral vision hardened into policy, a refusal to recognize Napoleon, a tilt toward Britain, and an isolation that left Sweden friend-poor and risk-heavy. The reckoning came with the Finnish War. Russia, allied to Napoleon after Tilsit, demanded that Sweden join the continental system against Britain. Gustav IV Adolf refused. Russian armies crossed frozen frontiers into Finland in early spring, moving faster than Stockholm's plans and taking fortresses before relief could arrive. Sveaborg, the granite shield raised in the Age of Liberty, surrendered after a contested siege, a shock that unhinged defense lines across the east. Swedish counterattacks, brave but disjointed, could not reverse the tide in a theater where the enemy held numbers, interior roads, and fresh supplies. Defeat bred revolution at home. Officers and officials, appalled by strategic mismanagement, staged a palace coup in the capital. The king was deposed and later exiled. The constitution was rewritten. The instrument of government of 1809 restored a balance between crown and estates, a stronger Riksdag to guard budgets and rights, a limited monarchy to supply unity and speed. The settlement enshrined civil liberties, cabinet responsibility, and the rule that war and taxation required parliamentary consent. It was a sober framework born of war's humiliation and an adult nation's refusal to repeat mistakes. The new king, Charles the 13th, was elderly and heirless. Sweden needed a successor who could command armies and respect constitutions. The estates first chose a Danish prince who died suddenly, closing one dynastic door and opening a surprising one. Attention turned to a French marshal, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, known for energy in the field and moderation in council. He had fought Sweden in earlier years, yet had spared Swedish prisoners and impressed officers with fair dealing. He also had something Sweden desperately needed: credibility with both Napoleon and the continental powers aligned against him. In 1810, Bernadotte was elected crown prince and took the name Karl Johan, soon to be Karl XIV Johan. He learned Swedish, studied the constitution, and began the delicate work of rebuilding alliances after a generation of oscillation. As Napoleon's fortunes waned, Karl Johan steered Sweden into the anti-French coalition while bargaining hard for the prize that could compensate for the loss of Finland. He promised to bring Swedish arms to northern Germany and to guard the flank of the Allied advance, if the powers would support Sweden's claim to Norway, long tied to Denmark. Campaigns in northern Germany and the Danish peninsula gave Karl Johan leverage. He fought with caution, preserving Swedish lives and striking where promises would be honored. Diplomacy converted battlefield positioning into treaties. At Kiel, Denmark agreed to cede Norway to the Swedish crown in exchange for compensation elsewhere, a deal the Norwegians themselves rejected by declaring independence. Karl Johan answered not with extermination, but with a limited campaign that respected Norwegian institutions while asserting union under the Swedish monarch. After brief fighting and careful negotiation, a union was sealed that allowed Norway its constitution and parliament under a shared king. The union with Norway, concluded in 1814, reset Sweden's geography and strategy. The realm accepted that Finland was gone and that the eastern Baltic would be shaped by Russia. It also accepted that prosperity would now flow from stability Western trade, and internal improvement rather than conquest. Karl Johan embraced neutrality as a craft, trading credibility for freedom of action and promising that Sweden would guard its coasts and laws while avoiding the entanglement of great power struggles. The navy protected commerce, the army drilled under the allotment system, the state invested in roads, schools, and the administrative sinews that had always been Sweden's quiet strength. This long arc from Gustav III to Karl XIV, Johan shows causality more than fate. A coup against party feuding produced reform and war. War produced naval innovation and a climactic victory at Svensksund. Assassination produced regency, and then a moralizing monarch whose choices invited a disaster in Finland. Disaster produced constitutional reinvention. That reinvention required a new dynasty. The new dynasty used alliance and restraint to trade one lost frontier for a sustainable union. Each turn answered the last, sometimes with wisdom, sometimes with pride, but always with a sense that Sweden's power flowed from institutions as much as from arms. Human lives ran through these changes. Sailors who had rowed to victory in the Skerries raised sons who labored in shipyards at Karlskrona and Gothenburg. Finnish families who had prayed in Swedish churches learned new borders and new governors while keeping old hymns. Norwegian farmers marched to defend a constitution written in spring and discovered that a negotiated union could preserve their voice. Swedish clerks who once copied orders for grand armies now drafted budgets for schools and poor relief, turning the skills of war into the habits of peace. By the close of this period, Sweden had traveled from late Baroque monarchy through parliamentary experiment, through royal revival and catastrophic war, to constitutional monarchy under a foreign-born king who made neutrality a policy rather than an accident. The imperial chapter had ended, but statecraft endured, and a new identity took shape around law, literacy, and restraint. In the next section, we trace how this settlement matured across the 19th century, as Sweden and its Norwegian partner navigated industrial change, social reform, and a durable commitment to staying out of great power wars.